In the long expanse of human time, there was an age when the world held no written memory, only drifting traces of footsteps and fading echoes of breath. Before the rise of kingdoms or the carving of symbols into clay, people moved across shifting lands with a quiet awareness shaped by stars, seasons, and the soft pulse of the earth. They carried knowledge in their bodies rather than in monuments, letting understanding flow from one generation to the next like a whispered lullaby that never settled in one place for long. In that ancient stillness, the difference between survival and meaning was subtle, almost inseparable, and every journey became a thread in a story that no one could fully capture. The official timelines we learn today glimpse only the final chapters of a vast human tale. Beneath them lies an older realm, where clans wandered across continents, guided not by maps, but by instinct and inherited memory. These early families watched the sky with a patience we no longer possess, sensing approaching storms, migrations of animals, and the slow tilt of the seasons. Their wisdom lived in motion, not permanence, and because nothing was written, everything depended on trust, listening, and a shared understanding that life itself was a fragile exchange between land and people. The earth they walked upon was different from ours, shaped by cold winds, melting ice, and coastlines now buried under rising seas. Forests spread where deserts now stand, and wide grasslands rippled beneath skies untouched by cities. In those shifting landscapes, people learned to read the world as if it were a living manuscript. The flight of birds hinted at distant water, the rustle of leaves suggested unseen danger, and the shape of clouds warned of storms forming beyond the horizon. Their senses were not primitive, they were refined by necessity, honed by countless lifetimes spent watching the world without distraction. Yet, these early humans were not only observers, they were dreamers. Around evening fires, they shared stories of origins, spirits, and the hidden order of things. These tales did more than entertain. They organized the invisible structures of belief, morality, and expectation long before temples or thrones existed. Myths became the architecture of their minds, sturdy enough to survive migration, loss, and the collapse of familiar landscapes. As clans drifted apart and rejoined over centuries, these ideas traveled with them, carried across mountains, forests, and forgotten coasts. Archaeology uncovers only fragments of this world: a carved bone, a painted handprint, a carefully arranged burial. But these traces reveal a complexity we rarely attribute to such early times. They point to communities that understood cooperation, ritual, and the subtle power of symbolic thought. These were societies that built their foundations not in stone but in memory, shaping social bonds that could endure hardship and change. Their technologies were simple by modern standards, yet their ability to adapt, innovate, and teach made them astonishingly resilient. Modern history begins with writing, but human civilization began much earlier, in the silent agreements and shared dreams of these forgotten peoples. Their lives formed the deep roots from which later cultures grew. And although the earth has swallowed many of their traces, echoes of their world remain hidden in myths, migration routes, and the quiet instincts that still guide us in moments when logic falters. If we listen closely, we may sense that their stories are not entirely gone. They linger in the landscapes we cross today, in ancient pathways beneath our cities, and in the enduring human longing to understand where we came from. The clues are subtle, but they remain, waiting to guide us into the next chapter, where the earliest maps of meaning begin to take shape. These remnants invite us to look deeper, to notice how every myth, every shared memory, and every ancient symbol still carries the faint breath of a world older than history itself. Long before the first symbols were pressed into clay or carved into stone, early humans shaped their understanding of the world through patterns that could be carried in memory. They lived in a reality where knowledge had to move with them, surviving storms, migrations, and the slow turning of generations. Because nothing could be written down, everything essential was woven into stories that blended the practical with the mysterious. Myths became vessels for direction, warnings, and shared experience, disguised beneath the rhythm of narrative. In these tales, rivers spoke, animals offered guidance, and the sky itself became a teacher. The purpose was not entertainment alone, it was preservation. Across vast distances, people tracked the movement of stars with an ease that feels extraordinary today. By watching nightly patterns, They learned when seasons shifted and when herds would migrate. Constellations were not abstract shapes but maps suspended above the world. They pointed toward water, signaled the right moment to travel, and marked the boundaries of familiar landscapes. Each clan carried its own version of these celestial maps, refined through countless journeys. What we now call myth was once a precise and trusted method of orientation. Families migrating out of Africa relied on constellations to guide their steps across open savannas and dense forests. When they eventually reached new shores, these same star patterns helped them recognize where they stood in the broader world. Early groups crossing into Australia followed coastlines lit by moonlight, navigating by memory etched deep through repeated storytelling. Their roots became inherited knowledge, passed on through chants and epics that held both history and direction. Even long after some coastlines drowned under rising seas, the stories remained, preserving the memory of places no longer visible. These oral maps could stretch across centuries. A story about a great serpent might encode the danger of flooded rivers. A tale of a wandering ancestor might mark the safest valley, or the shelter hidden behind a ridge. Symbolic thinking allowed early humans to compress entire landscapes into compact images that could be recalled even in moments of crisis. This ability to translate physical distance into narrative form shows a cognitive sophistication often underestimated. Their minds were tuned to patterns that repeated through time: winds, tides, migrations, celestial cycles. Each repetition reinforced memory, creating a mental atlas far more durable than any fragile parchment. Some ancient communities developed chants that listed landmarks in order, allowing travelers to move confidently through terrain they had never personally seen. Others used carved tokens or painted symbols to trigger rehearsed stories that unlocked deeper knowledge. Settlements that once lined, now submerged coastlines likely shared elaborate oral instructions on fishing grounds, tidal movements, and seasonal dangers. Though the ocean has erased these early homes, echoes of their knowledge survive in distant myths that seem strangely aligned across cultures separated by oceans. Archaeologists often uncover hints of these forgotten systems: a carved bone aligned to a star, a pattern repeated in cave art far from its origin, a legend about a long-lost shore told by people who live nowhere near the sea. These fragments suggest that oral traditions once held immense details too refined to be accidental. The absence of written records does not imply a lack of intelligence. Instead, it reveals a reliance on memory as the primary instrument of survival. When we listen to ancient myths with patience, patterns begin to reappear. Stories that once seemed fantastical transform into carefully encoded instructions, remnants of a world where every word carried weight. They reveal an intellectual world older than cities, older than agriculture, rooted in observation and quiet understanding. These early humans relied on skills that modern civilization has largely forgotten: the ability to remember without writing, to navigate without tools, to interpret the sky as a living guide. These skills formed a quiet foundation, preparing early humans for innovations that would slowly shape the civilizations yet to rise. In time, in the long twilight before history began to write itself, early humans developed skills that reveal a depth of intelligence often overlooked. They moved through vast landscapes with an assurance that came not from maps, but from generations of accumulated experience. Their journeys stretched across savannas, mountains, and tundras, guided by a profound sensitivity to the environment. The position of the sun, the texture of winds, the calls of distant animals, and the shifting color of the horizon formed a living compass that allowed them to navigate farther than we once imagined. What might seem like instinct was, in truth, learned knowledge passed down through careful teaching and quiet observation. These early communities shaped their surroundings with a subtle form of engineering. They understood how water behaved, how soil responded to seasonal change, and how fire could transform both landscapes and tools. Long before agriculture emerged, people built temporary weirs to catch fish, managed wild herds by guiding their movements, and used controlled burns to renew grasslands. Their relationship with the earth was not one of domination, but of intimate cooperation, shaped by an understanding that survival required balance rather than force. This sophistication challenges the assumption that ingenuity arrived suddenly with the first cities. Toolmaking itself was an art refined over tens of thousands of years. The shaping of stone required patience, rhythm, and a precise awareness of angles. A single tool might represent hours of focused skill, guided by techniques taught through demonstration rather than language alone. Pigments used for painting were carefully mixed from minerals and charcoal, revealing experimentation and aesthetic sensibility. Even early fiberwork twisting plant strands into rope or weaving simple baskets shows deliberate craftsmanship that speaks to refinement over generations. These were not crude improvisations, but the expressions of people dedicated to mastering their materials. Cooperative hunting strategies further reveal a society rich in communication and shared intent. Large game could not be taken by strength alone. It required planning, coordination, and trust. Hunters moved in silence, each knowing their place in patterns practiced before they were born. Some drove animals toward hidden cliffs or natural traps, while others waited in positions determined by deep knowledge of animal behavior. This level of coordination emerges only in communities with strong social bonds and a collective sense of purpose. It suggests that leadership, mentorship, and shared responsibility existed long before settlements grew permanent. Spiritual rituals were another pillar of ancient life, offering structure to moments of uncertainty and transition. Burials adorned with beads, pigments, and deliberately placed tools indicate beliefs about continuity beyond death. Caves filled with handprints and symbols reveal ceremonies that may have marked rites of passage or attempts to speak with unseen worlds. Firelit gatherings likely served both practical and sacred roles, places where knowledge was transmitted, disputes resolved, and myths renewed. These rituals reinforced social cohesion, ensuring that each person felt rooted in something larger than themselves. The early spiritual world was not primitive fear. It was a system for meaning, identity, and unity. Archaeological discoveries increasingly hint at early humans with astonishingly complex cognitive worlds. Sophisticated stonework appears in places thought too early for such refinement. Pigment processing sites older than many civilizations suggest continual artistic expression. Even small items, carved figurines, beads fashioned from shells transported miles inland, show curiosity and symbolic thinking. These artifacts, scattered across continents, reveal people who were observant, inventive, and capable of abstraction. Their minds were not waiting to awaken. They were already active, shaping culture long before any record survived. The social systems supporting this knowledge were equally remarkable. Teaching occurred through repetition, shared tasks, and ritualized instruction. Elders preserved memory, not in writing but in performance songs, chants, gestures, and nightly retellings. Children learned by watching and participating, absorbed into a flow of generational wisdom. Artisan knowledge, whether flint knapping or dye making, passed through trusted lineages, ensuring continuity across centuries. These networks formed the quiet foundation of the civilizations that would one day rise along the Nile and between the rivers of Mesopotamia. As climates shifted and the world began to change, these resilient cultures adapted, carrying their tools, stories, and skills into new environments. The next stage of their journey reveals how the Earth's transformation shaped humanity's path. In the age when ice ruled the edges of the world, humanity moved through a landscape shaped by silence and cold. Sheets of frozen earth stretched across continents, turning valleys into corridors of wind and pale light. The air itself seemed sharper, carrying a clarity that forced every breath into a visible cloud. In this unforgiving world, early humans learned not only to survive, but to understand one another with an intimacy shaped by shared effort. Cooperation was not an option, it was the single thread holding life together. Bands of travelers crossed frozen plains where nothing broke the horizon, except distant herds and the slow pulse of glaciers. Their footsteps carved faint paths through snow that drifted, erasing trails soon after they formed. Families moved as a single organism, listening to the land with heightened attention. The crack of faraway ice could signal the shifting of a glacier, just as a sudden hush in the wind warned of storms gathering beyond sight. This knowledge shaped intuition into guidance. Around night fires, people gathered close, sharing warmth and stories that kept fear at bay. Flames flickered against shelters of hide and stone, casting shadows that danced like spirits performing ancient rituals. These nights became the cradle of early imagination. Tales of creation, ancestors, and unseen forces were whispered into the dark, each one a blend of memory and hope. Storytelling bound groups together more tightly than any tool, allowing shared identity to survive even as landscapes shifted. The cold taught them that community was as vital as fire. Hunting in this frozen world demanded unity. Large game moved cautiously across icy fields, their survival as precarious as that of the humans who pursued them. Hunters spread out in silent formations, communicating through gestures and glances honed over seasons. Success required timing, trust, and an understanding of animal behavior that felt instinctive. Each hunt strengthened social bonds and confirmed the value of cooperation in a world that punished isolation. The Ice Age also shaped early innovation. Tools adapted to cold conditions, bone needles for stitching thick hides, scrapers designed for frozen meat, and crafted shelters meant to withstand fierce winds. Fire became an art, mastered in environments where a spark meant life. Families learned to store food beneath snow, using the earth as a natural preservative. These techniques reflect a creativity spurred not by abundance, but by the relentless pressure of winter. Kinship structures deepened under these conditions. Harsh climates required people to rely on extended families and tight-knit groups, forming alliances that endured. Teaching became a sacred duty. Elders passed down wisdom about star positions, migration routes, and the subtle language of ice. Children learned through watching, imitating, and listening to stories repeated every night until the words settled into memory. This era forged a continuity of knowledge that would echo into future civilizations. The landscape itself shaped emotion and belief. The rumble of glaciers inspired reverence, while snowfields offered vastness that stirred spiritual curiosity. Some caves served as sanctuaries, warmed by fire and marked with early symbols. Here, humanity practiced its oldest rituals, seeking connection with forces greater than themselves. The cold did not silence creativity. Instead, it sharpened imagination, pressing people to seek meaning in a world that seemed both beautiful and perilous. This frozen age sculpted the mental frameworks that later cultures inherited. The discipline learned from tracking seasons, the unity forged through shared hardship, and the instinct to read nature as a living map all became seeds of civilization. And yet, the ice did not hold the world forever. As it slowly withdrew, it revealed new horizons, coastlines, valleys, and passageways that invited humanity to wander farther than before. The thaw marked not an ending, but a turning point that opened paths into lands waiting to transform the human story once more. Somehow, when the great ice sheets began to withdraw, the world entered a slow unraveling. Rivers swelled, valleys flooded, and ancient coastlines shifted like breathing things. What had once been firm ground softened into marshland, and regions where early humans had lived for ages began disappearing beneath rising water. The melt was not sudden, yet its effects were relentless. Every season revealed a shoreline slightly farther inland, a reminder that the world itself was changing shape. Families who once lived near tidal pools and open beaches found their homes swallowed by the encroaching sea, carrying memories and footprints into depths no human would see again. These lost coastlines were not empty places. They held gatherings, hearths, and the first experiments in settled life. Drowned beneath what is now the Mediterranean were valleys where rivers merged into wide deltas, likely home to early fishing cultures. In Southeast Asia, a vast landscape once connected islands now scattered across the ocean. Trails, villages, and sacred sites lay beneath waters that deepened year after year. Along the shores of the Americas, early camps that watched migrating herds now rest on the seabed, untouched since the last hunters saw them. The map of early humanity was rewritten by water, turning familiar pathways into submerged memories. With every rise in sea level, pieces of history slipped away. What survived on land tells only part of the story. The rest lies beneath hundreds of feet of ocean, hidden in darkness. For generations, people lived along coasts, rich in fish, shellfish, and sheltering coves. These environments encouraged experimentation with nets, boats, and tidal traps. When the waters rose, these innovations vanished with the shorelines that nurtured them. It is possible that some of humanity's earliest advancements were coastal, created by communities later erased from view. Archaeologists have found hints of these worlds, tools buried in offshore sediments, remnants of forests preserved beneath the sea, and ancient riverbeds traced through underwater scans. Each discovery is a reminder that much of human antiquity is still unknown. The ocean floor holds stories older than writing, stories that once belonged to people who watched the horizon creep closer each year. Imagine fires burning along beaches now drowned, or songs carried across waves that later claimed their shores. These fragments create a vision of early life, far richer than the scattered evidence available on land. As sea levels climbed, humans adapted by moving inland. Yet moving inland meant leaving behind knowledge shaped by the sea. Communities changed their tools, their diets, and their stories. Flood myths emerged across cultures, echoing memories of lands taken by water. The same tale appears in regions separated by oceans. A rising sea, a vanishing world, a need to begin. Whether literal or symbolic, these myths hint at shared experiences rooted in the Great Melt. The drowned landscapes of the past invite reflection. How many gatherings, rituals, and creations lie hidden beneath the waves? Did early navigators craft boats more advanced than we expect? Did coastal cultures trade across distances long before cities existed? Without their settlements preserved, we can only imagine the scope of their ingenuity. The ocean keeps these secrets, holding them in stillness beneath shifting currents. Yet the rising water did more than erase. It revealed the resilience of early humanity. As coastlines vanished, people learned new ways to live. They sought higher ground, followed rivers upstream, and discovered fertile lands inland. These migrations spread ideas across continents, blending traditions and expanding the human story. Every loss of shoreline was also the beginning of new journeys, shaping cultures that would one day give rise to civilizations. Among the submerged realms formed during this transformation, one stands out for its scale and mystery. In the heart of Southeast Asia lies a drowned world that once connected countless islands, a place known as Sundaland. It is there that clues may wait, offering insight into a cultural explosion long forgotten. Where the islands of Southeast Asia scatter across warm blue waters, there was once a single immense homeland now called Sundaland. During the last ice age, when sea levels were far lower, this region formed a continuous expanse of forests, rivers, and plains, connecting what are now Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and parts of Thailand. It was a place where early humans lived beside rivers that no longer exist, and gathered along shores now hidden beneath the ocean. Sundaland may have been one of humanity's earliest cultural heartlands, a foundation older than the civilizations that later rose along great rivers. Archaeological hints suggest a population large and dynamic. Stone tools recovered from submerged sites show craftsmanship equal to inland regions of the same age. Traces of ancient forests, preserved in salt water, confirm that wide stretches of land once linked islands now separated by deep channels. These clues imply early humans thrived here, experimenting with tools, fishing techniques, and seafaring. The rivers of Sundaland likely served as natural highways, allowing communities to travel, trade, and share ideas over long distances. Some researchers propose that Sundaland supported early coastal cultures, whose innovations later spread across Asia. Its vast estuaries and shallow seas offered rich grounds for fishing and foraging. People built stone fish traps, wove nets from plant fibers, and learned to read tides with precision. Their knowledge of currents and coastal winds may have enabled travel between distant points of the ancient shoreline. What seem like isolated groups may have been parts of a larger cultural fabric stretching across this drowned continent. The idea of early seafaring in Sundaland rests on more than speculation. Some of the oldest evidence of long-distance ocean crossings appears nearby. Humans reached Australia over 60,000 years ago, a journey requiring navigation across open water. The most plausible staging ground for such an undertaking lies within the ancient coasts of Sundaland. From these shores, early travellers may have set out with knowledge refined by generations of watching the sea. Their journeys hint at a cultural confidence that challenges the assumption that early humanity feared the ocean. When sea levels began to rise at the end of the Ice Age, Sundaland started shrinking. Waters crept inland, swallowing river deltas and hunting grounds where families had lived for ages. What had once been an immense homeland became a chain of scattered islands. Communities were forced to abandon ancestral territories, carrying their stories and technologies into the wider world. Some moved north into mainland Asia, others followed coastlines east, eventually populating distant islands of the Pacific. Still others travelled south toward the lands that remained above the water. These migrations scattered the knowledge born in Sundaland across thousands of miles. Myths echo traces of this forgotten world. Flood stories appear throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific, describing lands claimed by rising seas and ancestors who fled from drowning plains. While these narratives may not describe specific events, their persistence suggests deep cultural memories shaped by real upheaval. They hold the emotional truth of a world slowly consumed, where families watched familiar hills sink beneath waves and shorelines retreat year after year. The ocean floor beneath the Java Sea reveals submerged river systems, ancient channels that once carved through fertile valleys. Along these hidden rivers may have stood early settlements, now buried under salt water. Scattered artifacts retrieved by fishermen, stone blades, pottery fragments, carved ornaments, raise further questions about the scale of early life in this region. Much of what existed remains inaccessible, protected by depth and time. Sundaland's disappearance marked not the end of a culture, but its transformation. The people who left carried knowledge of tides, navigation, and coastal survival. They adapted to new environments, blending their traditions with those of the groups they encountered. In doing so, they helped shape new cultures across Asia and the Pacific. Migrations from this drowned world may have seeded the roots of later civilizations, influencing tools, languages, and early spiritual practices. As we move forward, the story of Sundaland becomes a bridge to a larger truth. The first great teachers of humanity may have been ocean travelers who learned to survive a world in motion. Their movements foreshadow the migrations that would spread early ideas across continents, guiding us into the next chapter of human history. After the seas rose and swallowed the homelands their ancestors had known, early humans began drifting across new territories with a sense of quiet determination. They did not wander aimlessly. They carried something far more enduring than possessions, the memory of how life once was. These travelers moved through mountains, forests, and plains, with stories wrapped around their footsteps. Wherever they traveled, they carried fragments of their lost world. Knowledge shaped by tides, winds, and the teachings of elders traveled with them, preserved not in writing, but in living memory. To outside eyes, they might have looked like small bands seeking refuge, but within their circles, they understood themselves as keepers of vital truths. Around dim campfires, as sparks drifted upward and faded into the dark, elders repeated tales of coastal lands, now drowned, and rivers that once carved deep paths through the earth. These stories were not laments, they were maps of memory. A listener learned which plants healed, which currents carried fish, and which stars guided travel. Each night became a lesson disguised as a tale, ensuring the past remained alive within those who had never seen the lands being described. Firelight became their classroom. Children sat close, tracing shapes in the dirt as adults recited the movement of constellations. A single finger swept across the ground, marking where a star rose and where it would settle at season's end. Such lessons carried generations of observation. Knowledge lived in action. A gesture could teach more than many words, and repetition carved certainty into the minds of the young. These people were living libraries, storing and sharing wisdom through breath, rhythm, and the simple act of gathering together. The travelers also carried rituals that reminded them of who they were. A handful of ochre painted on a stone, a carved symbol placed beside a river, or a chant repeated during long walks became anchors for identity. These rituals kept families anchored while moving. Their spiritual practices honored the vanished world and the new one ahead. Ritual became the bridge between memory and adaptation, allowing people to feel continuity even as landscapes changed around them. Their survival techniques were equally essential. They remembered how to read cloud formations that hinted at storms, how to follow subtle tracks through unfamiliar forests, and how to build shelters that blended the old ways with new conditions. Their innovations grew from memory. Every challenge became a chance to refine skills inherited from those who had endured the Great Melt. In this sense, each journey was both an act of resilience and a continuation of a legacy that refused to fade. What united these dispersed groups was not territory but teaching. Everywhere they stopped, they shared knowledge with those they encountered. Sometimes it was a method for preparing food. Other times it was a story explaining a star's slow arc across the sky. Their teachings were subtle, embedded in songs, demonstrations, and shared work. They shaped communities through example, guiding others without claiming authority. People learned from them without realizing the depth of the inheritance they were receiving. These carriers of fire and memory were quiet architects. They built no monuments, yet their influence spread farther than stone could endure. They seeded cultures with ideas of cooperation, reverence, and careful observation. Their contributions formed the scaffolding upon which future societies would rise. The earliest forms of leadership, justice, and collective responsibility echo the presence of these ancient travelers who preserved knowledge by living it. As they moved deeper into new lands, the memories they carried blended with local customs. New social structures took shape, organized hunting groups, shared rituals, and informal councils that guided decisions. These early teachers shaped the foundations of what would become proto-civilizations. Their footsteps marked the beginning of a world built not only from the places people inhabited, but from the knowledge they protected and passed onward. Soon, these teachings would shape early societies, guiding humanity toward the next stage of its unfolding story. In the earliest chapters of human society, long before writing or monuments, people organized themselves through bonds of trust rather than rules etched in stone. Clans formed from families who shared blood, land, and memory, creating circles of responsibility that held communities together. These circles were not formal governments, yet they functioned with remarkable stability. Every person knew their role: who hunted, who gathered, who taught, and who tended to the young. These roles flowed naturally, shaped by experience, and reinforced through quiet expectation rather than command. Within each clan, cooperation served as the foundation of survival. Hunting bands, coordinated through subtle signals, a hand raised, a stone tapped, a shift in posture. These gestures carried meaning refined across generations. A single look could determine when to move, when to wait, or when danger lurked nearby. Such shared understanding required no leaders issuing orders. Instead, it relied on a collective rhythm, a trust that everyone would act for the good of the whole. This was the first blueprint of social order, harmony formed not by force, but by familiarity. Yet clans rarely lived in isolation. They met with neighboring groups during migrations, seasonal gatherings, or shared hunts. During these moments, early councils emerged. Elders and skilled hunters would sit together, often around a fire, exchanging information about distant herds, shifting weather, or new rivers revealed by receding ice. Decisions flowed through conversation rather than decree. The oldest voices carried weight, but no single person ruled. Instead, consensus shaped the path forward. This simple model, listening, discussing, agreeing, became one of humanity's first social technologies. Rituals strengthened these bonds. Shared dances, songs, and symbols created a sense of unity that stretched beyond individual families. During rites of passage, entire clans gathered to recognize a child's first hunt or a youth's transition into adulthood. These events carried meaning that extended beyond celebration. They affirmed belonging. They reminded each member that their life was part of a larger weave, supported by countless others. Ritual acted as a silent contract, renewing the unspoken agreements that kept the group whole. Trust extended into daily life. When families shared food, tools, or shelter, they reinforced the idea that no one survived alone. Even conflicts were resolved through methods that avoided lasting fractures. Elders listened to both sides, offering guidance meant to restore balance rather than punish. These early forms of mediation reflected an understanding that stability mattered more than victory. Over time, patterns of fairness and reciprocity emerged. Though unwritten, these patterns shaped behavior with the same force later laws would attempt to capture. Trade further broadened these networks. Groups exchanged stone blades, pigments, woven fibers, and stories. With each interaction, relationships grew stronger, and new understandings took root. People learned which neighboring clans could be trusted, which paths were safe, and which regions required caution. Through this slow, steady exchange, early humans built alliances that spanned large distances. These bonds created a broader sense of belonging, not just to a single clan, but to a web of connected communities. The true genius of these early societies lay in their ability to form order without hierarchy. No palaces, no armies, no rulers, only agreements shaped by necessity and refined through repetition. Civilization, in its earliest form, was not a structure but a system, a way of sharing responsibility, communicating expectations, and balancing individual needs with collective good. These proto-blueprints would one day influence the rise of villages, chiefdoms, and nations. But in their earliest expression, they were simple, flexible, and deeply human. As these systems matured, they began intertwining with symbolic and spiritual practices. Rituals no longer marked only life events, they became frameworks for understanding seasons, relationships, and the unseen forces shaping the world. Social order and spiritual meaning grew inseparable, and in this merging, communities found a deeper sense of unity, preparing the way for the next stage of human organization, where belief and structure would rise together. In time, long before the first stones were stacked into temples or the first priesthoods claimed authority, early humans shaped spiritual worlds that existed not in monuments, but in the quiet chambers of the mind. These worlds were born from the need to understand an unpredictable earth. Storms broke across the sky without warning, seasons shifted with no explanation, and death came like a shadow no one could chase away. In such a landscape, meaning was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Spirituality became a tool for surviving not only the world outside, but the world within. It offered comfort, guidance, and a way to hold communities together even when everything else felt uncertain. The first spiritual leaders were not rulers. They were storytellers, dream interpreters, and keepers of memory. Around evening fires, they spoke of ancestors walking among the stars, of animals carrying messages across the threshold between life and death, and of unseen forces woven into wind and water. Their voices softened fear, giving shape to the unknown. Through these early teachings, people learned that storms carried warnings, that seasons followed patterns, and that death, though final, need not sever connection. Meaning emerged through metaphor, repetition, and a shared desire to understand. Burial practices reveal how deeply these early beliefs ran. In caves where ochre handprints glow faintly under torchlight, archaeologists have found bodies laid to rest with beads, pigments, and carefully placed tools. These were not random arrangements. Each gesture, placing a stone near a hand, scattering red earth across the chest, suggested care and intention. To bury someone with beauty was to acknowledge their worth, to honor their place in the community, and perhaps to guide them into whatever waited beyond sight. The living gathered around these rituals not merely to mourn, but to reaffirm their unity. Sacred sites also began to emerge, subtle at first. A ring of stones aligned with a solstice sunrise, a clearing where every hunt began with a whispered chant. A cave, whose walls carried painted animals so vivid they seemed to move in the flicker of firelight. These places were not elaborate, but they were consistent. People returned to them generation after generation, treating them as thresholds between the ordinary and the extraordinary. In doing so, they created the earliest forms of sacred architecture spaces, shaped by intention rather than engineering. The sky played a central role in these spiritual frameworks. At night, families lay beneath the stars, tracing constellations that carried stories from distant ancestors. A cluster of lights might be a hunter forever chasing an animal across the heavens. Another group might represent the spirits of children lost to illness, shining as reminders of purity and hope. These stories served as more than entertainment. They taught navigation, predicted seasonal shifts, and reinforced shared values. Each constellation was a living library, storing information in patterns anyone could learn to read. Spirituality also acted as a moral compass. Early stories warned against greed, selfishness, or dishonoring the group. Others celebrated sharing, courage, or humility. These narratives shaped behavior more effectively than commands could. A child who heard a tale of a selfish hunter punished by spirits carried that lesson into adulthood. A youth who learned of a brave ancestor rewarded by the winds understood the worth of generosity and courage. Through myth, communities built systems of ethics long before laws existed. Dreams held special significance. Some individuals possessed a heightened sensitivity to visions, interpreting symbols that emerged in sleep. These dream guides were often approached after conflicts, before migrations, or during sickness. Their insights, whether intuitive or imaginative, held weight. People believed dreams connected the living with the unseen, offering warnings or blessings depending on their nature. In this way, Dreams became part of the community's decision-making process, blending psychology with spirituality. Perhaps the most remarkable achievement of these early spiritual architects was their ability to create unity. Shared beliefs turned strangers into kin. Rituals synchronized emotions across the group. Stories transformed fear into understanding. In a time when survival depended on cooperation, spirituality was not superstition, it was infrastructure. It held communities together through hardship, shaped their understanding of the world, and offered a sense of purpose when little else felt certain. As these spiritual ideas grew more complex, they began shaping the spaces people gathered in. A circle of stones aligned to a celestial event suggested the first blueprint for sacred architecture. A painted cave became a ceremonial hall. A firelit clearing evolved into a sanctuary. These early expressions of meaning would eventually inspire humanity to build structures that embodied their beliefs, guiding us toward the next chapter where spirit and stone would finally meet. Long before the first villages gathered around fields of grain, long before writing spread its symbols across clay and bone, small groups of humans were raising stones toward the sky. These monuments, silent, weighty, and enduring, stood in places where no cities existed, where people were still hunters, wanderers, and keepers of stories rather than farmers or builders of kingdoms. And yet, they shaped stone with a purpose that outlived every memory of the hands that lifted it. These structures whisper a truth we often overlook. Architecture began not with houses, but with meaning. At Gobekli Tepe, in the hills of southeastern Turkey, a circle of carved pillars rises from the earth like the bones of an ancient dream. The pillars are tall, smooth, and impossibly deliberate. Some bear animals etched with exquisite care: lions, birds, foxes, creatures that may have carried symbolic weight in a world still ruled by instinct and survival. The site predates agriculture, pottery, and settled life. People carried stones weighing many tons, carved them with tools of simple flint, and arranged them in patterns aligned to rituals no one alive can fully interpret. Yet the intention is unmistakable. These were not shelters. They were symbols, places for gathering, remembering, and reaching towards something larger than themselves. Far to the northwest, across the wind-swept plains of the British Isles, prehistoric stone circles rise from green fields, like frozen echoes of forgotten gatherings. They stand in silence, but they once marked moments of cosmic importance. Some align with solstices, others with equinoxes, all pointing toward a relationship between humans and the sky. These monuments suggest a vision of time deeper than seasons, deeper than migration cycles, an understanding that the heavens themselves were part of the human world, guiding life with a rhythm older than memory. The stones became mirrors of the sky, capturing the sun's slow arc and the moon's steady wanderings. Across the African continent, stone alignments and megalithic clusters lie scattered across deserts and high plains. Some are arranged in spirals, some in rows, some positioned near ancient trade routes older than language as we know it. In places like Nabta Playa, long before the pyramids rose, people gathered stones to mark celestial events and ritual seasons. These were communities still moving with herds, still living from the unpredictable generosity of the landscape, yet they took the time to lift stones into patterns that outlasted every footprint around them. Here too, architecture began not as shelter, but as a statement. In Asia, forgotten sites lie buried beneath forest floors or half visible beneath shifting soils. Stone mounds, circular platforms, and standing pillars suggest ritual gatherings that connected communities across vast distances. Some were aligned with mountain peaks, others with rivers, others with constellations that guided migration. Ancient builders understood that placing stones in the landscape could anchor memory, giving future generations a place to return to, a place where stories and identities could be renewed. Their monuments were invitations to continuity. What unites these distant sites is not their form but their purpose. They reveal that early humans shared a desire to shape the world with intention, to leave behind markers of belief and belonging. These were sacred spaces, built by people who had no cities, no written laws, no formal leaders. Yet they coordinated labor, shared effort, and held collective visions strong enough to move massive stones. The act of building reflected more than strength. It reflected trust. It reflected planning, unity, and a sense that community meant more than the needs of any individual moment. To lift a stone together was to declare, "We are one people. We remember. We believe." These monuments were not the beginnings of civilization, they were the beginnings of identity. They transformed open land into sacred ground, turning ordinary spaces into places where myth, memory, and community intertwined. The stones stood as anchors for stories and rituals, as reminders that humanity was becoming something more than scattered bands surviving from day to day. These early structures carried the seeds of cooperation that would one day shape villages, tribes, and nations. And from this simple yet profound act, lifting stones in unity, another transformation began. The act of building brought people together in ways that reshaped their social world, guiding us naturally into the next chapter, where cooperation itself became a creative force. Long before the first villages appeared on hilltops or riverbanks, human life unfolded in small circles, families, clans, and wandering bands that followed the rhythms of animals, seasons, and water. Yet something extraordinary began to shift when people started gathering for reasons greater than survival. Whether drawn by shared rituals, promising hunting grounds, or the quiet hum of trade, groups converged in specific places again and again. These gatherings, fleeting, seasonal, and often sacred, became the earliest sparks of community life. At first, the gatherings were simple. A few clans might meet near a river where fish swarmed in predictable cycles, or beneath a plateau where herds migrated across the plains. But as generations passed, these meetings grew in scale. Word travelled along hunting routes and through marriage ties. Signals etched on bone or whispered in story carried news of an upcoming assembly. Slowly, the gatherings expanded from dozens to hundreds, and in some rare moments, perhaps even thousands. For people accustomed to moving in small family groups, the sight must have been astonishing. Fires dotting the valley, voices rising like birdsong, the scent of cooking drifting across the dusk. Such gatherings required coordination far beyond everyday life. To lift stones for monuments or prepare for communal hunts, people had to synchronize their actions. Hunters from distant territories learned to communicate through shared signals. Toolmakers compared techniques, traded blades, and passed along innovations that might otherwise have remained hidden within a single clan. Women shared knowledge of herbs, weaving, and food preservation. Elders sat together, not as rulers, but as voices of memory, smoothing old tensions and shaping collective decisions. Through dialogue rather than dominance, they created the earliest versions of councils, spaces where ideas flowed freely, and solutions emerged from listening rather than force. Trade flourished in these gatherings. Objects moved from hand to hand, obsidian from volcanic mountains, shells from far coasts, pigments from deep riverbeds. Each exchange carried more than material value. It carried stories. A stone blade from a distant region brought news of unfamiliar landscapes. A woven pouch hinted at techniques different from one's own. Trade became a form of cultural weaving, binding communities together with curiosity and appreciation rather than conflict. Intermarriage strengthened these bonds. When someone from one clan married into another, alliances emerged naturally. Families gained new voices, new skills, new stories. Children born from these unions carried in their memories the languages, symbols, and customs of two worlds. Over time, these ties reduced the likelihood of conflict. Instead of competing, clans recognized themselves as part of a growing web of relationships. Cooperation became not just useful, but expected. Ritual gatherings added deeper meaning. At certain times of year, groups traveled to sacred circles or stone alignments to celebrate solstices, give thanks for successful hunts, or honor ancestors. These events blended the practical with the spiritual. People danced, drummed, feasted, and shared stories that stretched so far into the past they bordered on myth. The energy of hundreds of people moving in unison fostered a sense of belonging no small clan could replicate. Rituals became the glue of early society, transforming gatherings into moments where identity expanded beyond the family circle into something larger. These great meetings also became opportunities for conflict resolution. Disputes that lingered between clans could be addressed in neutral spaces, guided by elders from multiple groups. Solutions emerged from shared principles of fairness, reciprocity, and respect values, strengthened by the presence of so many witnesses. In this way, early gatherings acted as courts, councils, marketplaces, and festivals all at once. Innovation thrived in these settings. When people worked together to lift stones, carve symbols, or coordinate hunts, knowledge pooled. Techniques improved. Ideas traveled. Lessons once held within a small band became common across entire regions. Slowly, without anyone intending it, the gatherings created systems, patterns of behavior, decision-making, and cooperation that formed the earliest blueprints of organized society. And from these patterns, something new began to emerge. Temporary encampments grew larger. Some groups stayed longer than others. Certain valleys, river mouths, and plateaus became familiar to generations, drawing people back again and again until the landscape itself hummed with memory. What began as fleeting assemblies gradually evolved into hubs of continuity, places where people felt rooted, even if only seasonally. These gatherings were the quiet ancestors of cities. They were built not from conquerors' ambitions, but from shared purpose. Cooperation, storytelling, problem-solving, celebration. And as people gathered more often, for longer periods, the idea of staying, of building something more lasting, began to take shape. From here, the path leads naturally to the next transformation, the shift from temporary meeting places into semi-permanent settlements, where architecture, agriculture, and identity began intertwining in new and powerful ways. For countless generations, human life drifted across the land like wind never fixed, always following the rhythms of food, season, and opportunity. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changed. In certain valleys, at certain river bends, on certain plateaus, where the world seemed to breathe differently, people began to linger. What had once been brief gatherings now stretched across seasons. What had once been temporary, hearth circles grew warm from long-term use. These places, half camp, half sanctuary, became the earliest shadows of what would one day be known as settlements. The first change was subtle, a return. Families came back to the same sheltered ridge year after year. Hunters recognized familiar vantage points where herds moved with predictable grace. Gatherers knew where certain routes thrived, where fruit ripened longest, where water pooled even in dry months. Memory began binding people to landscapes. A place was no longer just a point on a journey, it became a chapter in a family's story. Where people returned, they built. Not houses as we know them, but structures meant to persist just long enough to welcome them again. Stones arranged to reinforce a windbreak, wooden posts marking a ceremonial circle, storage pits dug deep enough to protect food from animals. These small efforts signaled a profound shift. Humans were beginning to shape the land with intention, preparing it for future gatherings that were no longer accidental but expected. These gathering sites often formed around sacred centers. A carved stone, a painted cave wall, or a ceremonial mound became a magnet for memory and meaning. Spirituality and practicality intertwined. People came for ritual, but once gathered, they traded, hunted together, repaired tools, shared stories, and made plans. A sacred site was not merely a symbol, it was infrastructure long before the word existed. At night, fires burned in the same arrangements season after season, their ashes layering into quiet archives beneath the soil. The ground remembered gatherings, even when individuals did not. These hearths became the first permanent features of human life. Around them, people stored food in woven baskets sealed with clay, kept spare tools in small alcoves, or built shaded shelters to protect sleeping children from wind and dew. These daily gestures softened the boundary between temporary and permanent, giving rise to a new idea: staying. With staying came experimentation. People noticed which wild plants sprouted strongest near their seasonal camps. Seeds dropped accidentally or deliberately grew where humans spent the most time. Small patches of tended earth began appearing at the edges of gathering sites. Farming had not yet begun, but the spark was visible. Early water channels were carved from simple observation. A diverted trickle here, a reinforced bank there. These quiet innovations foreshadowed the complex irrigation systems that would one day support civilizations. Trade, too, deepened. When people gathered in the same place repeatedly, they established routes paths beaten into the soil by predictable movement. Some led to distant quarries rich in obsidian, others to river deltas thick with reeds or clay. These pathways became the earliest trade networks, supporting the movement of materials and ideas. The land itself became a map of connectivity, shaped not by rulers, but by repetition. Communal structures also emerged. In some regions, people built longhouses shared by multiple families, marking the first experiment in collective living. In others, the focus was on ceremonial plazas, open spaces kept clear for gatherings, dances, and seasonal rituals. These plazas were the ancestors of public squares and marketplaces. They were where decisions were made, where alliances were confirmed, and where the pulse of a community was felt most deeply. With more people spending more time together, social life grew richer and more complex. Elders became advisors. Skilled hunters or artisans gained informal status. Disputes required gentle negotiation. Cooperation was no longer just useful, it became essential. These early communities learned that harmony was something to be nurtured. The more people shared, the more they depended on shared rules, shared memory, and shared identity. This was the quiet birth of organization. The settlements that emerged during this era were not yet cities, but they carried the seeds of cities within them. A ceremonial mound hinted at future temples, a longhouse hinted at future districts, a trade path hinted at future roads. The world was changing, one returning footstep at a time. Yet growth brought new challenges. More people meant more mouths to feed, more disputes to settle, more decisions to make. Storage, land use, and cooperation became matters of survival, not convenience. And as populations slowly thickened, the pressures of living together began reshaping everything from food strategies to social expectations. These pressures would soon push humanity into the next transformation. A world where settlements became villages, where scarcity sparked conflict, and where early innovation collided with early competition. Civilization's gentle dawn was beginning to glow brighter and more complicated. Long before the scribes of Mesopotamia pressed symbols into wet clay, long before the Nile's kingdoms rose behind their gleaming walls, a quiet fire burned across the high plains and rolling hills of Anatolia. Here, in a landscape of gentle slopes, fertile valleys, and volcanic peaks, early communities shaped ways of life so intricate that they challenge our sense of when civilization truly began. The world remembers the rivers, the Tigris, Euphrates, Indus, Nile, but it often forgets the plateaus where people lived in ways strikingly advanced for their time. Anatolia was not a fringe. It was a hearth. The most striking testament to this early brilliance lies in Çatalhöyük, a settlement older than many of the civilizations we call ancient. It was not a village of simple huts scattered across open land. It was a dense honeycomb of interconnected homes, built wall to wall without streets. People moved across the rooftops like a secondary landscape. They entered their homes through openings in the ceilings, descending ladders into warm, clay-lined rooms, lit only by small fires. These homes were intimate spaces where daily life, ritual, and memory intertwined. On the walls, people painted scenes of hunters, leopards, and geometric shapes that echoed meanings we can sense, but no longer fully grasp. What stands out most in Çatalhöyük is not architecture alone, but intention. Every inch of the settlement feels deliberate. Platforms for sleeping, alcoves for storage, hearths placed with precision, and walls plastered again and again with fresh clay, as if renewal was part of the rhythm of life. Burials beneath house floors suggest a deep bond between the living and their ancestors. People slept above generations past, weaving memory into the very foundations of their homes. Some skulls were painted with ochre or plastered to restore the contours of the face, as though the dead continued to watch over the household. These customs reflect a spiritual worldview both intimate and complex. Yet, Çatalhöyük was only one flame in a larger Anatolian constellation. On distant hilltops, places like Gobekli Tepe reveal a society capable of astonishing collective effort even before the advent of farming. Great stone pillars carved with animals stood arranged in circles that must have taken immense labor to create. These were gathering places, sanctuaries shaped not for shelter, but for ceremony. People traveled long distances to take part in rituals beneath those stone guardians. The animals carved into the pillars, birds, snakes, foxes, suggest stories, myths, and cosmologies that predate the written word by thousands of years. These sanctuaries were built by hunter-gatherers, not farmers. Their existence challenges the idea that religion and monumental architecture emerged only after agriculture. In Anatolia, it may have been the other way around. Sacred gatherings inspired people to settle, to stay, to plant. Spirituality fostered stability, and stability fostered community. The discovery that the oldest pillars of Gobekli Tepe were buried intentionally, carefully covered, and preserved by the people who built them, adds yet another layer of meaning. It suggests reverence not only for the ceremonies, but for the passage of time itself. Anatolia's early communities also displayed remarkable artistic skill. Figurines carved from stone and bone depict humans with serene expressions, animals mid-stride, and abstract designs that hint at symbolic traditions. Wall paintings show erupting volcanoes, sprawling herds, and patterned shapes that may represent stories shared during long winter nights. These works were not decorations. They were expressions of a worldview in which life and spirit blended seamlessly. Art became a form of communication, a language that required no writing to hold weight. Agriculture in Anatolia appears to have developed gradually, shaped by experimentation rather than sudden change. People tended wild grains, stored surplus food, and lived in communities that could sustain larger populations. With more people came more complexity, divisions of labor, shared responsibilities, and long-term planning. In many ways, these early settlements embodied the first city mindset: cooperation, continuity, and a sense of belonging to something greater than the individual household. To walk through the remains of Anatolia's ancient sites is to feel the presence of lives lived with intention. These were not primitive people, stumbling toward civilization. They were architects of meaning, sculptors of community, and storytellers whose influence rippled far beyond their hills and valleys. Their ideas about ancestors, ritual, shared labor, and sacred space would travel across continents, shaping cultures that never knew their names. As we move forward, Anatolia serves as a reminder that the ancient world had many cradles, not one. And just beyond its plateaus and sanctuaries lie other forgotten spheres of brilliance, landscapes where the seeds of civilization sprouted quietly, waiting for their stories to be remembered. Long before wheat fields rippled across empires, and granaries fed ancient kings, a quieter story unfolded along the gentle slopes and river valleys of the Levant. Here, in a landscape shaped by soft rains, rolling hills and fertile soil, small communities began to notice patterns in the world around them, where seeds fell, where plants sprouted, and how the earth responded when disturbed. These early observations were simple, almost accidental, yet they carried within them the first hints of a transformation that would one day reshape the human story. The people of the Levant were still foragers and hunters, moving with the seasons and following migrating herds. But their world was changing. As the climate warmed after the Ice Age, wild grains spread across the region in golden patches. Barley and einkorn wheat grew in abundance, rising without effort from the ground. People gathered these grains year after year, learning their habits the way they once learned the habits of animals. They noticed which valleys produced the fullest seeds, which hillsides dried quickest, which patches survived harsh winds. Slowly, a thought emerged, quiet, fragile, and new. What if the earth could be encouraged to give more? The first experiments were hesitant. A handful of seeds scattered near a campsite, a patch of soil cleared to test whether sunlight mattered, a dried stalk shaken intentionally so seeds would fall where they could be watched. Nothing about these early actions felt revolutionary. Yet they required patience, a willingness to wait weeks, then months, for results that were never guaranteed. These people were not yet farmers, but they were becoming something different from their wandering ancestors, caretakers of possibility. With time, patterns revealed themselves. Some seeds sprouted stronger when buried lightly. Others grew best where water pooled after rain. The first irrigation channels were nothing more than shallow grooves in the earth, guiding trickles of water toward vulnerable shoots. But even this small shaping of the landscape marked a shift in humanity's relationship with nature. People were no longer only responding to the world, they were beginning to coax it, shape it, and imagine what it could become. Communities adapted to this new rhythm. Seasonal camps transformed into long-term settlements, where families stayed to watch their crops grow. Granaries, simple mud structures lined with woven reed mats, appeared beside hearths. These early storage places were symbols of trust. Trust in the harvest, trust in time, trust that the world would continue to give if treated with care. For the first time, food could be saved for leaner months. With stored grain, came stability. With stability came planning. Rituals soon intertwined with farming. Planting was not merely work, it was ceremony. People whispered to the soil, sang to the seeds, marked the phases of the moon, and told stories that linked growth to spirits and seasons. Planting cycles became frameworks for spiritual meaning. The first festivals were likely simple gatherings honoring rain, sun, and earth. In these gentle rituals, people acknowledged the uncertainty of their new path and sought reassurance from forces greater than themselves. Domestication followed a similar path. Goats and sheep were first attracted by leftover grain near campsites, then tolerated, then guided, then gently shaped across generations into partners rather than wild creatures. People learned which animals could thrive near settlements and which needed freedom. A delicate relationship emerged, one built not on dominance but on observation, respect, and slow experimentation. Through these acts, scattering seeds, shaping water, saving food, guiding animals, communities grew. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a river carving a valley over centuries. Families stayed longer in one place. Children grew up recognizing the same hillsides year after year. Memory settled into the landscape. Identity took root. The Levant became a quiet cradle of transformation. No grand monuments marked this shift. No kings declared it. No scribes recorded the first sprouts. Instead, civilization emerged from patience, from hands in the soil, from careful watching, from hope that the earth would respond kindly to human touch. And as these early farmers shaped their small worlds, another transformation dawned further east. Across mountains and plains, another forgotten cradle experimented with its own forms of growth and innovation. The story of agriculture was never singular. It was a tapestry woven across continents, each region carrying its own spark. Long before the rise of emperors, palaces, and the great Bronze Age kingdoms of ancient China, a quieter world thrived along the broad, winding curves of the Yellow River. Here, on its fertile terraces and silt-rich floodplains, early communities lived with a rhythm shaped by the river's unpredictable spirit. They were neither subjects of a state nor builders of grand walls. They were farmers, potters, dreamers, and observers, people who learned to read the earth long before they learned to rule it. Their villages were simple clusters of earthen homes, shaped from packed clay and arranged in circles around communal hearths. Smoke rose gently at dawn as families prepared meals from millet, gathered from wild stands or grown in early cultivated patches. These hearths were more than places of warmth and cooking. They were the beating centers of each settlement. Around them, elders shared stories, children listened with wide eyes, and the day's work was quietly planned. Tending fields, repairing tools, gathering reeds, and watching for signs of shifting weather. Pottery became one of their earliest arts. In shallow pits lined with stone, people shaped clay into bowls, jars, and ritual vessels, decorating them with swirling patterns that echoed the movement of water and wind. Some of these early designs resemble symbols, proto-writing forms that carried meaning long before formal scripts emerged. A curve might represent a river bend. A spiral might evoke the cycle of seasons. A set of parallel lines might hint at rain, harvest, or ritual order. These marks were not records of bureaucracy, but expressions of perception, memory, and belief. The Yellow River, often called China's sorrow in later ages, was both a giver and a taker even then. Its floods brought life-sustaining silt, but they could also sweep away entire settlements in a single night. Because of this, the people who lived along its banks developed an unusually intimate understanding of nature's cycles. They watched the sky for subtle color shifts, traced moisture in the air, listened to the river's murmuring tone, and studied the behavior of animals. Their knowledge formed long before it was ever formalized, an intuitive philosophy born of patient observation. Communal living shaped their worldview. Villages worked as units rather than collections of isolated families. People gathered for festivals celebrating harvests, full moons, or ancestral spirits. During these feasts, clay drums echoed across the night, and dancers moved in slow, deliberate circles, mirroring the passage of celestial bodies. Food was shared freely, not simply for nourishment, but to reinforce unity. These events wove threads of connection that became the foundation for social harmony, the early roots of ideas that would one day appear in Chinese philosophy. Shamans served as mediators between the visible and invisible worlds. Dressed in feathers, animal skins, or painted symbols, they guided ceremonies calling upon river spirits, mountain guardians, or ancestral presences. Through trance, chanting, and movement, they interpreted dreams and omens, helping their communities navigate uncertainty. Their role was not that of authority, but of insight, an early form of philosophical inquiry that asked not just what happened, but why, and what the world was trying to say. Archaeological discoveries reveal long-term planning within these early communities. Water channels guided runoff toward fields. Raised storage pits protected grain from moisture and pests. Walls of woven reeds reinforced flood barriers. These systems reveal a society learning to cooperate with nature, not dominate it. In many ways, the philosophy of balance that would define later Chinese thought began here, in the constant dialogue between people and river, effort and acceptance, intention and flow. Burial customs further illuminate their worldview. Some graves contain tools, pottery, ornaments of bone or jade, or traces of pigment placed on the body. These objects speak of care, remembrance, and an early sense of continuity beyond death. Families return to these burial sites season after season, leaving offerings or performing small rituals to honor those who came before. This cyclical reverence for ancestry foreshadowed traditions that would later shape entire civilizations. In these early river cultures, the seeds of great ideas began to take root, not as formal doctrines, but as ways of seeing, harmony with nature, respect for ancestors, communal responsibility, and the belief that meaning flows through the rhythms of the world. These values did not appear suddenly during the dynasties. They were shaped across thousands of quiet years, whispered through rituals, encoded in pottery, and embodied in daily life. As we step from these early riverbanks toward the broader landscape of ancient humanity, the picture becomes clearer. Civilization blossomed in many places at once. And as Chapter 6 begins, we turn to something older than trade or conquest, an invisible force that connected these early cradles long before empires rose, the shared spark of human curiosity. Long before the world knew the concept of a road, and long before maps sought to capture the shape of continents, human movement followed the gentle logic of the land. Rivers carved routes through valleys, coastlines offered predictable resources, and mountain passes opened windows between worlds that otherwise seemed sealed. These natural corridors were not designed. They were discovered slowly, through the soft insistence of footsteps that repeated themselves across generations. In time, they became the earliest pathways connecting distant communities, carrying not caravans or merchants, but stories, tools, and the presence of other lives. Migration in ancient times was not a single event but a pulse. Families moved toward warmer climates as seasons shifted, followed herds along established trails, or drifted toward river deltas rich in fish and reeds. Over thousands of years, these movements formed invisible lines across the earth. They were not marked with stones or signs, yet they were unmistakably real, worn into soil, remembered in song, and passed from elder to child with the precision of memory rather than measurement. Along these paths, rivers became teachers. Their currents pointed the direction of valleys and plains, guiding travelers with gentle persistence. People learned the character of each river, the one that flooded often, the one lined with medicinal plants, the one whose bends revealed rich patches of clay for pottery. Walking beside a river was like walking beside a companion, predictable in some ways, temperamental in others, always leading somewhere new. Coastlines offered their own form of guidance. Families moved along shores where food was abundant, and danger was visible from a distance. Tides shaped the rhythm of travel. Seabirds signaled where fish gathered. Shells scattered along beaches hinted at distant lands, reminders that worlds existed beyond the horizon, long before boats grew large enough to chase that mystery. Every path taken along the coast carved another thread in humanity's sprawling web. Mountain passes played a quieter role. They were thresholds, sometimes steep, sometimes gentle, opening into unfamiliar valleys where other groups lived according to their own traditions. Those who crossed carried more than goods. They carried impressions. They remembered the scent of different trees, the shapes of tools used by strangers, the tones of languages unfamiliar yet oddly comforting. Each crossing created a point of connection, a place where two worlds brushed lightly against one another. Over generations, these footpaths became conduits for more than movement. They carried rituals. A song about a harvest moon might travel dozens of miles before returning in a new shape. A particular style of pottery decoration might appear in valleys far from where it originated. A burial practice, placing stones in a circle, painting bodies with ochre, leaving offerings near the head, could leap across landscapes without armies or merchants to carry it. People were enough. Marriage alliances further deepened these connections. When individuals from distant communities joined their lives, entire networks merged. Traditions mixed gently, like streams joining into a single river. A new way of weaving might enter a settlement. A healing herb known in one valley might become familiar in another. Through marriage, the world expanded not through conquest, but through kinship. Even myths traveled these paths. A story told around one fire could be retold hundreds of miles away, altered slightly by each teller yet carrying the core truth across landscapes. These stories were the earliest cultural travelers carrying symbols, warnings, hopes, and the shared understanding that the world was larger than any one settlement. Through them, people came to view themselves not as isolated clans, but as part of a larger human tapestry. The effect of these pathways was profound. Without realizing it, ancient humans formed networks of exchange long before cities rose or writing emerged. Ideas moved as effortlessly as footsteps. Tools improved through steady diffusion. Beliefs blended into early spiritual frameworks. Across mountains, deserts, forests, and coasts, humanity grew interconnected through quiet, continuous movement. As these paths deepened, something else began to change. People not only exchanged stories and rituals, they exchanged goods. Stone, pigment, shells, and crafted objects began to travel farther than their makers ever could. These simple exchanges marked the dawn of trade, setting the stage for a new kind of connectivity that would soon reshape entire regions. And so the footsteps continued, leading us toward the next chapter, where pathways became corridors of exchange, and the world's first trade networks began to take shape. Long before coins, markets, or merchants ever existed, people exchanged objects that shimmered with meaning. These early trades did not take place in bustling squares or under the watchful eyes of officials. They happened quietly between individuals, between families, between small communities meeting at rivers, coasts, or seasonal gathering grounds. Trade began not as an economy, but as a language, a way to communicate trust, respect, and curiosity in a world where no one yet spoke of wealth. One of the earliest items people traded was pigment. Red ochre, yellow clay, and mineral powders carried across valleys and mountain footholds, shared between groups who valued color as a connection to spirit and identity. To receive a small bag of pigment was to receive a piece of someone's homeland, the soil of another world. These powders decorated bodies, blessed rituals, and coated the dead in symbolic warmth. Exchanging pigment was like exchanging stories about the earth itself. Shells traveled even farther. Carried from coastlines into distant inland settlements, they became objects of wonder. A single shell could represent a journey none of the recipients had ever taken. Its smooth curves and pale shimmer spoke of far-off waves, of winds that never reached their valley, of tides that shaped the rhythms of another community. Some shells were pierced and worn as necklaces. Others were placed near sleeping children or woven into ceremonial garments. Their value lay not in rarity, but in the connection they created, proof that the world was wider than the eye could see. Obsidian, sharp, black, and gleaming, was another treasured item. Its edges could cut flesh or shape wood with a precision unmatched by other early tools. Communities living near volcanic regions often possessed more obsidian than they needed, and they shared it with groups far from its source. To trade obsidian was to share power, in a way. The power to hunt better, carve better, and survive more safely. But it also carried symbolic weight. The stone's mirror-like surface reflected firelight in ways that seemed almost otherworldly. Some believed it held spiritual potency, a connection to the earth's fiery heart. Feathers also moved along these pathways. Bright feathers from tropical birds or highland species became ornaments with meaning far beyond decoration. Worn in rituals, danced with during ceremonies, or used to identify important members of a clan, feathers symbolized both beauty and belonging. When exchanged, they acted as diplomatic offerings, gifts that softened tensions, sealed friendships, or honored guests. Medicinal plants formed another quiet network of exchange. A root that soothed fever, a leaf that healed wounds, a resin that eased breathing, these items travelled from region to region through healers and midwives who shared their knowledge with neighbouring groups. Such exchanges were acts of generosity and mutual survival. A cure discovered in one valley could save lives in another. Knowledge moved with the plants, creating early scientific traditions grounded entirely in oral memory and shared experience. Among the most intriguing traded items were symbolic artifacts, small carved stones, figurines, beads, or tokens whose meanings often remain mysterious. Some depict animals with exaggerated features. Others resemble human forms with serene or expressive faces. These artifacts may have been used in rituals or storytelling. Perhaps they served as protective charms, teaching tools, or reminders of ancestral bonds. When gifted, they communicated respect and continuity, linking families across vast distances. Trade during this era was rarely transactional. It was relational. People exchanged what was beautiful, useful, or meaningful not to accumulate wealth, but to deepen connection. Sitting around shared fires, travelers told the stories behind each object, where it came from, who crafted it, which spirits blessed it, what lessons it carried. Each exchange strengthened alliances. Each gift reinforced trust. These early trades formed the first threads of long-distance connection. Objects moved farther than the people who carried them. Knowledge travelled with every item. Over generations, these exchanges created cultural corridors that eventually stretched across whole continents, linking regions that never knew each other's names. And as trade expanded, something remarkable happened. Patterns formed. Similar objects began appearing in places separated by mountains and deserts. Certain tools or symbols spread widely. The world was becoming interconnected not by empires or armies, but by the steady, quiet movement of people sharing what mattered to them. This growing network sets the stage for the next transformation, a world where trade routes spanned vast distances and humanity's earliest global web began to take shape. Long before caravans crossed deserts or ships traced lines across open seas, early humanity was already woven together by threads so faint they left no clear markings on the ground, yet strong enough to shape the destiny of continents. This invisible web was not designed, declared, or recorded. It grew naturally, through footsteps, curiosity, and the quiet exchange of objects and stories. Archaeology reveals hints of it everywhere, like scattered echoes of ancient conversations. These clues remind us that long before civilization, humanity was already connected in ways we are only beginning to understand. One of the most striking pieces of evidence comes from shells found far inland, sometimes hundreds of miles from their coastal origins. These shells were not carried accidentally. They were treasured, shaped into beads, worn as ornaments, or buried with the dead. Their presence deep in deserts or mountains suggests a chain of exchanges that stretched far beyond the movement of any single group. A shell might travel through many hands before reaching its final resting place, passing from valley to valley in a relay of curiosity and shared meaning. Obsidian tells a similar story. This volcanic glass, prized for its sharpness and mesmerizing sheen, has been discovered in settlements far from any volcanic source. Through chemical analysis, researchers can trace its origins, revealing journeys that often spanned hundreds of miles. Obsidian moved across plains, along riverbanks, through forests, and over mountain passes. Its travel suggests not chaos, but continuity, a consistent network of interactions linking communities that might never meet face to face. The stone became a traveler, carrying knowledge, style, and possibility across entire regions. Even myths bear witness to these ancient connections. Stories about great floods, sky serpents, trickster animals, or ancestral journeys appear in cultures far separated by geography. These tales are not identical, but they share symbolic shapes, as though carried along through whispered retellings that evolved with each community that adopted them. A myth might drift from one gathering site to another, reshaped by accents, memories, and landscapes, yet retaining a recognizable core. These echoes suggest that ideas travel just as far as objects, sometimes farther. Art offers another glimpse into the web. Spiral motifs, crosshatch designs, animal figures, and abstract patterns appear in caves and pottery across vast distances. Though not identical, they share an underlying rhythm that hints at shared cognitive worlds. How did similar symbols emerge so widely? Perhaps they travelled through exchanges of decorated objects. Perhaps migrating families carried them as memories. Or perhaps the human mind, observing the same sky and earth, simply recognized the same patterns. Whichever the case, the spread of these designs reveals a level of cultural connection far older than written history. The web was not merely material or symbolic, it was relational. When groups met at shared hunting grounds or seasonal camps, they exchanged more than goods. They exchanged marriages, rituals, and skills. A fire-making technique developed in one valley might appear generations later in a distant forest. A new tool design might spread gradually across landscapes, adopted because it solved a problem or carried status. Even music and rhythm travelled, passed through gatherings where people drummed, danced, and sang into the night. This web also transmitted knowledge of the natural world, information about edible plants, dangerous animals, healing herbs, or navigational landmarks spread from one region to the next. Such knowledge could save lives, and those who shared it were held in respect. In this way, early humans created a learning network long before the existence of schools or scholars, a decentralized, evolving archive of lived wisdom. As these connections grew thicker, the boundaries between groups softened. Humanity became a patchwork of overlapping identities rather than isolated pockets. The concept of a global world is often treated as something modern, something born from ships or digital networks. But in truth, the first global moments unfolded quietly, thousands of years before civilization began. Objects, ideas, genes, and stories crossed landscapes in intricate patterns, binding distant peoples with invisible ties. And while these early networks lacked roads, maps, or written contracts, they carried something far more powerful: imagination. Every traded object, every shared tale, every symbolic mark whispered a possibility that the world was bigger, richer, and more connected than any one group could see. This growing, imaginative landscape would eventually nourish the roots of religion, philosophy, art, and myth. As we step into Chapter 7, we follow the path of this deeper connection, a shared inner world that grew alongside trade, the spread of collective imagination, the dreams that moved with people like seeds on the wind, shaping what humanity believed it could become. Long before cities rose from riverbanks or kings carved their names into stone, human beings built worlds out of breath and memory. In the deep quiet of ancient nights, when darkness pressed close and the stars shimmered like distant fires, families gathered around small, flickering flames. It was here beneath open skies, with nothing but embers and imagination, that storytelling was born. These early stories were not recited from scrolls or carved into tablets. They lived in the voices of elders, shaped by rhythm and pause, by gesture and firelight. A story might begin with a simple observation: a thundercloud swelling on the horizon, the shape of an animal track, or the echo of wind through a ravine. From these fragments, worlds unfolded. Spirits walked across the sky, ancestors guided the living, and the land breathed with intention. The earliest storytellers were interpreters of existence, weaving meaning from mystery. Children sat closest to the fire, their faces illuminated by shifting shadows. Behind them, adults listened with a familiarity that never dulled. Even if they had heard the tale 100 times, the repetition felt like a ritual, a reaffirmation of their place in the world. The stories explained why storms came without warning, why animals migrated in circles, why certain paths were safe and others forbidden. These lessons were woven seamlessly into the narratives, teaching survival not through commands but through wonder. Some stories preserved knowledge of the land. An elder might describe the great river that changed its course every few years, warning listeners to never build a shelter too close to its banks. Another tale might recount a hunt gone wrong, teaching young hunters how to read the wind, how to move silently, or when to retreat. These lessons were not dry instructions. They were anchored in emotion, in fear, in triumph, in laughter, so that even the youngest listener would remember them long after the storyteller's voice faded. Other stories carried the weight of origin. Where did fire come from? Why did the moon chase the sun? How did humans learn to speak or dream? These tales offered frameworks for understanding the unknown. They comforted those who feared the dark and inspired those who wondered about the sky. In a world where nature often felt overwhelming, stories acted as guides, mapping unseen forces and giving people a sense of place in a vast, shifting landscape. Some stories strengthened community bonds. They praised shared values, courage, generosity, loyalty, and warned against behaviors that threatened group harmony. A tale about a greedy hunter who hoarded meat might end with his downfall, reminding everyone that survival depended on sharing. Another story might celebrate a child who saved the clan through curiosity or kindness, teaching that wisdom could come from unexpected places. Through these narratives, early humans built moral frameworks long before laws or rulers existed. Storytelling also marked time. Certain tales were reserved for winter, when the world felt still and introspective. Others were told during migrations, guiding families through unfamiliar landscapes with metaphors disguised as instructions. Ritual stories accompanied births, hunts, deaths, and seasonal changes, turning ordinary events into sacred moments. Storytelling became a way for communities to synchronize their emotions, beliefs, and memories. In many gatherings, the telling of a story was as important as the story itself. The way an elder paused before revealing a twist, the dramatic sweep of a hand, the mimicry of an animal's call, all transformed simple narratives into living experiences. Shadows cast by firelight danced on cave walls, giving characters a fleeting physical presence. It was as if the world of the story briefly overlapped with the world of the listeners. These early tales traveled across landscapes just as tools and trade goods did. A story told in one valley might appear generations later in another, shaped by new accents, climates, and symbols. Over time, these shared narratives created an invisible network of cultural memory that stretched across continents. Long before writing, humanity was already building an archive, one held in hearts and voices rather than in stone. Storytelling was humanity's first architecture. It built invisible structures of identity, morality, and belonging. It turned scattered families into communities, and communities into cultures. Through stories, early humans made sense of their fears, their hopes, and their place in a world that was both beautiful and unpredictable. And as generations passed, these spoken worlds began taking new shapes, not only in sound, but in image. The same hands that tended fires and shaped tools soon reached for pigments and stone, giving visual form to the stories that lived in memory. Long before alphabets carved meaning into clay or paper, humans spoke through images. In the dim glow of torches carried into ancient caves, in the soft hum of wind brushing through highland shelters, and across open plains where rock faces waited like unwritten scrolls, early artists shaped the world's first language. Their tools were pigments, stone, bone, rhythm, and imagination. Their messages were both simple and profound records of hunts, dreams, fears, hopes, and the unseen forces guiding their lives. The earliest art did not aim for decoration, it aimed for communication. When a hunter traced the outline of a bison onto a cavern wall, he was not merely recording the animal's form. He was preserving knowledge, how the creature moved, where its strength lay, how the hunt unfolded. These images taught younger members of the clan what to expect long before they ever stepped into the wild. They were visual lessons, captured with strokes of ochre and charcoal. Inside the deep chambers of ancient caves, torchlight made the painted animals seem alive. Shadows flickered across walls, giving movement to shapes etched thousands of years ago. Horses galloped across stone arches, mammoths lumbered through alcoves. Human figures danced in spirals around symbols whose meaning remains mysterious, but unmistakably intentional. Each image carried a pulse of emotion, fear of failure, joy of survival, reverence for the animals that fed and clothed the group. These were not random sketches, they were meditations on existence. Carved figures also told stories. Small figurines sculpted from bone, antler, or soft stone captured the essence of human experience: fertility, protection, transformation, and spirit. Some figures emphasized strength, others highlighted vulnerability. A tiny carving held in the palm might guide a ritual, comfort a traveler, or anchor a family's memory of an ancestor. These objects moved with people across landscapes, carrying stories that could not be spoken in any single language. Ochre markings spread across continents, appearing in rock shelters from Africa to Australia to Europe. Red, yellow, and black pigments formed lines, dots, spirals, and handprints. A hand pressed against stone, surrounded by pigment, was a declaration. I was here. I lived. I belong to this world. These prints create an almost eerie connection across time. Thousands of years after the hands that made them turned to dust, the gestures remain, reaching toward us with a kind of ancient intimacy. Music, too, became a form of early art and early communication. Flutes carved from bird bones produced airy notes that echoed through valleys. Rhythms tapped on hollow logs or stretched skins synchronized communities during rituals and gatherings. Sound became another facet of this emerging language, shaping mood, memory, and meaning. A simple melody might signal a hunt, accompany a ceremony, or soothe children to sleep. Music wove emotion into social life long before any written poem existed. These artistic expressions transcended generations. A child who wandered into a cave might see the same painted deer his ancestors had drawn ages before. A carved figurine passed from hand to hand could survive hundreds of years, carrying meaning long after its creator was forgotten. Art allowed memory to outlive time. It turned fleeting experiences into lasting messages. Just as importantly, art connected distant groups. Similar patterns emerged across vast regions. Spirals, zigzags, animal motifs, celestial designs. These shared symbols acted like a prehistoric vocabulary. When two groups met, they could compare markings and find familiarity evidence that even if their words differed, their imaginations recognized the same rhythms of life. Art bridged the gaps left by language. The emotional intelligence embedded in early art reveals a truth we often overlook. Imagination was not a distraction from survival. It was part of survival. Through images, sound, and symbols, early humans explored meaning, communicated danger, celebrated joy, and bound communities together. Art shaped identity long before identity shaped art. And as people drew, carved, sang, and painted, their minds expanded to consider not just the world around them, but the world above them. The same instincts that created cave paintings soon turned toward the sky, seeking patterns in stars, seasons, and cosmic movements. From art grew understanding. From understanding grew wonder. And from wonder came humanity's earliest attempts to map the cosmos. Long before observatories crowned mountain peaks, long before calendars told people when to sow and when to reap, ancient humans learned to read the sky in ways both practical and profound. Night after night, under the cool breath of darkness, families lay on grass, sand, or stone, and watched the heavens unfold above them. The sky was not a backdrop then, it was a living storybook, a shifting tapestry of lights that seemed to speak in patterns older than memory. For early humans, the stars were companions in the long, quiet hours when the fire had dimmed and the world felt both vast and tender. The first astronomers were not specialists, they were dreamers. Hunters waiting out the night noticed how certain stars rose just before dawn or dipped below the horizon when the seasons changed. Migrating families recalled the tilt of a particular constellation that guided them towards safe valleys. Elders told stories about bright wanderers, planets that moved differently from the steadfast stars. Over time, these observations formed an unspoken understanding. The sky had rhythms, and those rhythms mattered. Early humans tracked these movements with remarkable sensitivity. A notch carved into a piece of bone might mark the return of a seasonal star. A row of stones aligned with sunrise on a solstice morning might help families anticipate the arrival of winter. These markers were not simple decorations, they were tools of survival, guiding migrations, hunts, and rituals. Some sites, thousands of years older than recorded history, show alignments so precise that they rival the earliest known observatories. These ancient structures whisper of minds attentive to the way light shifted across the horizon, to the first star visible after sunset, to the slow wander of the Milky Way across the sky. Dreams and visions shaped this celestial awareness. In a world without artificial light, sleep came easily, and dreams came vividly. People often fell asleep beneath the stars, letting the boundary between sky and mind blur. When they dreamed of animals running across the heavens or ancestors climbing star ladders, they believed the sky had spoken. Such dreams were shared at dawn, when the first embers of the fire glowed. A single dream could influence a day's decisions whether to travel, hunt, or prepare for ritual. Shamans played a unique role in interpreting these dream-sky connections. They watched the heavens with a kind of reverence, seeing in the stars stories of creation, cycles of life, and the movements of unseen forces. Through trance and meditation, they attempted to travel into the realm where sky and spirit met. Their guidance shaped ceremonies timed with celestial cycles. A dance performed when the Pleiades rose. A ritual offered when the moon was at its thinnest. A gathering held when certain stars hinted at the coming of rain. Navigation also blossomed from skywatching. Travelers learned to follow the arc of constellations, to recognize the appearance of guiding stars that remained steady through the night. Even without maps, ancient people crossed vast landscapes by trusting the heavens. They knew which stars would carry them toward warm plains or freshwater lakes. For migrants crossing open grasslands or deserts, the night sky became a compass that never faltered. Myths grew from these observations, shaping early cosmology. The steady circling of constellations became stories of eternal cycles. The rising of stars in winter spoke of spirits returning from distant journeys. The path of the Milky Way became a celestial river, a road of ancestors, or the spine of a great cosmic creature. These myths softened the fear of the unknown. They grounded people in a universe that seemed full of intention, expression, and meaning. The night sky also unified communities. Across continents, unrelated groups named similar patterns: hunters, birds, serpents, and guardians. Though separated by mountains, forests, and oceans, early humans saw the same stars and drew similar conclusions. The cosmos became a shared language, one that crossed distances far greater than any trade route. Through this shared sky, the seeds of collective imagination took root. As humans watched the heavens, they found themselves reflected there. The slow dance of celestial bodies taught patience, cycles, and possibility. It hinted that life moved according to larger rhythms. This awareness shaped rituals, guided migrations, and deepened storytelling. Skywatching became a spiritual practice, a scientific curiosity, and a cultural anchor all at once. And from this blend of wonder and observation came the next transformation. Watching the sky did not only expand the imagination, it inspired innovation. Patterns seen in the stars soon guided tools, structures, and technologies on Earth. As Chapter 8 begins, we step from the dreamlike world of celestial thought into the realm of early engineering, the moment when imagination first shaped the physical world. Long before the first plows cut into soil, or the first great stones were shaped into monuments, early humans began crafting tools that quietly changed the course of their destiny. These tools were simple by later standards: stones sharpened through patient tapping, bones polished to smooth curves, plant fibers twisted into resilient cords. Yet each one represented a leap in imagination. The quiet revolution of tools was not loud or dramatic. It unfolded across countless small moments: a spark of curiosity, a test of pressure, a new angle of strike. Through these tiny experiments, human beings learned to extend the reach of their hands and, in doing so, to extend the reach of their future. At first, tools were shaped by necessity. A dull stone would not cut meat efficiently. A brittle branch could not withstand the strain of digging. People learned by watching the world around them. They saw how certain stones fractured into predictable patterns, how animal bones held strength even after death, how fibers loosened when soaked and tightened when dried. Observation became the first teacher. A hunter noticing the edge of a broken rock might imagine sharpening it further. A gatherer struggling to open a nut might wonder if striking it with a different material would help. Small insights accumulated over generations, becoming a shared legacy of problem-solving. Early toolmaking required patience. Shaping stone meant striking it again and again, slowly removing flakes until an edge emerged. Too much force at the wrong angle could ruin hours of work. Children learned by watching elders perform these subtle motions: tap, turn, tap again, until the rhythm became second nature. Toolmaking was a craft, but also a meditation. Each movement invited reflection. What if I change this angle? What if I use a different material? What if I combine them? Curiosity guided every experiment. Over time, tools grew more specialized. Instead of a single multi-purpose blade, communities created scrapers for hides, awls for piercing, burins for engraving, and points for hunting. These refinements were not only functional, they also reflected new ways of thinking. People began imagining tools not merely as objects but as solutions. Each improvement revealed a deeper understanding of the materials at hand. Stone, bone, wood, and fiber became familiar companions, each with a personality and a potential waiting to be uncovered. Bindings were among the quiet breakthroughs that transformed human capability. By twisting plant fibers or animal sinew, early humans created cords with surprising strength. These cords held stone points onto wooden shafts, turning separate pieces into unified tools. A spear was no longer a sharpened stick, it became a composite creation, the result of multiple materials working together. Such innovations required foresight and planning, qualities that hinted at the mental leaps that would later build cities. Fire, too, became a partner in toolmaking. Heat-treated stone produced sharper edges. Hardened wooden points penetrated deeper into prey. Clay, when gathered and shaped near hearths, hardened into new forms. Through trial and error, communities learned to harness fire not only for warmth and cooking, but as a tool that transformed matter itself. These discoveries were rarely accidental. They were the result of minds willing to wonder how heat might alter the shape or strength of the world. Toolmaking also relied on shared teaching. Knowledge passed from parent to child, from skilled craftsperson to eager apprentice. Stories accompanied lessons, tales of ancestors who first discovered how to split stone or how to carve bone into needles. Each generation refined what the previous one had learned, creating a chain of memory that stretched far into the past. Tools became a living archive of human insight, carrying forward the triumphs and failures of countless unnamed makers. The quiet revolution of tools reshaped daily life. Hunting grew more efficient. Clothing became warmer and more durable. Shelters strengthened. Food preparation expanded to include plants once too tough or dangerous to eat raw. With better tools, people had more time. Time to experiment. Time to create. Time to imagine possibilities beyond immediate survival. And as tools improved, something remarkable unfolded. Humans began reshaping the land itself. The same patience and curiosity that carved stone edges would soon carve pathways, terraces, and irrigation channels. The tools that extended the hand would soon extend the world humans could build. Long before cities rose behind fortified walls, long before rulers issued commands or scribes recorded plans, early humans were quietly reshaping the world around them. Their engineering was not etched into stone tablets or celebrated with monuments. It lived instead in the soil they carved, the clay they molded, and the fires they tended with growing mastery. Through simple but powerful experiments, ancient communities learned to sculpt the elements themselves, transforming landscapes, building stability, and laying the groundwork for everything civilization would one day become. Water was among the first forces they learned to guide. In valleys where rainfall was gentle but inconsistent, early families dug shallow channels to direct runoff towards small patches of crops. They noticed how water followed a path naturally, slipping into grooves with graceful ease. Over time, these grooves deepened into purposeful channels. A few carefully placed stones could encourage water to linger in dry soil. Bundles of reeds could divert excess flow during storms. These modest interventions turned unpredictable rainfall into a resource that could be trusted at least a little. Water management became an early form of environmental partnership, shaped through patience and repeated observation. Earth, too, became a medium of transformation. Clay gathered from riverbanks or exposed through erosion proved surprisingly malleable in skilled hands. When mixed with plant fibers or sand, it could be shaped into bowls, storage vessels, or bricks left to dry in the sun. Families noticed that pottery lasted longer than woven baskets and kept food safer from pests. Over time, clay became indispensable. Beyond pottery, ancient builders crafted walls and floors by mixing earth with straw, stamping it into place to create shelters that withstood wind and rain better than temporary huts. These simple houses retained warmth in winter and stayed cool beneath the heat of summer, giving early communities stability they had never known before. Fire, once a wild gift found in lightning-struck forests, became something to shape with intention. Early hearths grew into clay-lined fire pits, designed to hold heat longer and burn more efficiently. Some communities molded clay ovens that glowed at dusk with steady warmth, allowing them to cook food more evenly or fire pottery into durable vessels. People learned how different woods produced different temperatures and how embers could be carried from one camp to another. Fire became more than survival, it became craft. With it, humans transformed raw ingredients, hardened tools, and illuminated the darkness. These feats of engineering might seem modest compared to later accomplishments, but they represented profound mental leaps. To carve a channel was to understand cause and effect. To shape clay was to envision transformation. To build a shelter was to anticipate future needs. Each act required imagination, something more than instinct, something rooted in foresight. These were the first steps toward long-term planning, a mindset that would eventually give rise to agriculture, architecture, and urban design. Shelters evolved alongside these innovations. No longer simple windbreaks or temporary huts, early homes were designed with intention. Some had storage pits dug beneath them, kept cool and dry by careful placement of stone linings. Others featured raised platforms for sleeping, protecting families from damp ground. Roofs were supported by wooden beams, angled to shed rain or snow. Over generations, these small structural decisions accumulated into architectural wisdom. Entire families could remain in one place through multiple seasons, allowing communities to expand both in size and complexity. Environmental manipulation also strengthened social bonds. Redirecting water required cooperation. Building shared ovens meant working side by side. Constructing shelters demanded many hands and synchronized effort. These tasks turned survival into shared achievement. People learned to trust each other, not only in hunting or gathering, but in shaping the world around them. This trust became a foundation for future settlements, where collaboration was no longer temporary but enduring. The stability created by these early engineering marvels changed everything. Families stayed longer, food could be stored for lean months, tools and pottery accumulated. Rituals developed around hearths that burned in the same place year after year. The land itself began to remember human presence through trenches, fire-blackened stones, and clay fragments buried in the soil. But the most remarkable engineering of this era was not physical, it was psychological. The same imagination that carved channels and fired pottery also shaped stories, rituals, and beliefs that helped communities understand their changing world. This deeper form of engineering of mind and meaning guides us into the next chapter of humanity's evolution. Long before stone walls rose around, cities or farms stretched across hillsides, early humans accomplished something far more remarkable. They learned how to live together. This was not an accident, nor a simple result of shared bloodlines. It was a form of engineering, quiet, subtle, shaped not by tools or materials, but by emotion, memory, and the delicate architecture of trust. Without this soft engineering, no village would have held together, no trade route would have flourished, and no monument would have risen from the ground. Cooperation was the first foundation of civilization. In scattered bands moving through forests, grasslands, and river valleys, daily life demanded collaboration. A single hunter could not bring down large prey alone. A lone gatherer could not collect enough food to last through unpredictable seasons. Families depended on one another, but as groups grew larger, the bonds that held them together needed strengthening. Early humans developed ways to reinforce these bonds, weaving an invisible net of shared responsibilities, obligations, and rituals that kept communities from unraveling. One of the earliest social technologies was shared labor. During hunts, each person played a role. Some drove animals toward traps or cliffs, others waited in ambush, others processed meat or hides. In building shelters or carving irrigation channels, groups worked side by side, learning the rhythm of collective effort. Over time, shared labor became more than necessity. It became identity. People took pride in contributing to something larger than themselves. The sense of we strengthened with every coordinated task. Communal feasts deepened these bonds. When a hunt succeeded, families gathered in open spaces, roasting meat over large fires. Stories were told, songs were shared, and gratitude flowed. These feasts were more than celebrations, they were social agreements. By distributing food fairly, groups signaled mutual respect. By eating side by side, they affirmed alliances. A feast could heal tensions, reinforce leadership, and elevate the status of those who contributed most. The memory of shared meals lingered, making conflict harder to justify and cooperation easier to maintain. Reciprocal gifting became another powerful tool. A carved figurine, a bundle of herbs, a beautifully shaped stone blade. Such gifts were not transactions. They were gestures of goodwill that created threads of obligation and gratitude. When one family gifted another a valuable item, they established a relationship that encouraged future cooperation. These exchanges helped balance disparities, soothe disagreements, and form long-distance connections between groups. Through gifting, early humans built networks of trust that stretched farther than their voices. Dispute rituals served as an early form of governance. Conflicts were inevitable: competition for resources, misunderstandings, emotional tensions. Instead of allowing these disputes to fracture communities, early societies developed processes to resolve them. Elders listened to both sides, mediating with patience rather than authority. Ritual gestures, placing stones between disputants, sharing symbolic objects, or performing calming chants, softened tempers and redirected aggression. These rituals were not legal systems, but they fulfilled the same purpose: maintaining balance. They allowed communities to remain whole even when disagreements surfaced. These social systems reveal an extraordinary truth. Humanity engineered emotional stability long before architectural stability. Early societies practiced empathy as a survival tool. A person who understood another's fears or hopes could navigate cooperation more effectively than one who relied solely on strength. Emotional intelligence became as crucial as hunting skill or tool-making ability. Communities thrived because they recognized feelings, needs, and vulnerabilities, and built rituals that honored them. Teaching played a key role as well. Elders taught children not only how to craft tools or gather food, but how to behave within the group. Stories conveyed moral lessons. Songs carried instructions about fairness, courage, and respect. By embedding ethics in memory-rich forms, early humans ensured that cooperation would continue from generation to generation. In this way, culture became a kind of psychological infrastructure, a guide for behavior that kept groups aligned. As groups grew larger, cooperation extended beyond immediate families. Inter-clan gatherings created alliances. Shared ceremonies united distant groups under common beliefs. Trade routes, still informal and fluid, linked communities across mountains and plains. Through these connections, cooperation scaled. A network of trust gradually expanded, binding far-flung regions into loose spheres of influence. These early alliances would eventually become the scaffolding on which future civilizations built their power. The engineering of cooperation allowed humanity to think beyond the present moment. When people trusted one another, they could plan farther ahead. They could build structures meant to last more than a season. They could invest time in crafting tools, tending crops, or storing surplus food. Long-term planning became possible only because social harmony made long-term survival plausible. This unseen form of engineering of hearts, minds, and relationships was the quiet force that shaped humanity's rise. Before a single city wall was built, the foundations of civilization were already in place, held together by agreement, ritual, and shared intention. As these social innovations took root, they prepared the world for even greater transformations. In Chapter 9, we move into an era where cultural shifts, belief systems, symbols, migrations, and shared myths began to ripple across entire continents, reshaping what humanity would become. History remembers the loud civilizations, the ones that carved their triumphs into stone or left monuments standing against the wind. But for every culture that survived in memory, countless others rose quietly and vanished just as quietly, leaving almost nothing behind. These forgotten societies lived full lives. They raised families, crafted tools, buried their dead with ceremony, and watched the same sunrises we do. Yet time, ever patient, erased their footprints. Before writing, before cities, before kings, entire worlds flourished and disappeared without a single name recorded. Imagine a settlement nestled at the edge of an ancient forest, where homes of earth and timber once stood warm with cooking fires. For generations, families gathered beneath the trees, sharing stories, shaping tools, and navigating the cycles of seasons. Then the climate shifted. Rains changed their rhythm. Rivers carved new paths. The forest thickened. Gradually, people moved on seeking safer lands, more predictable resources. The old homes collapsed, covered by moss, swallowed by roots. Centuries later, the forest floor looked untouched, as though no one had ever lived there. Across windswept deserts, dunes hide similar secrets. Beneath layers of sand lie the remains of early communities that once thrived along riverbeds, now long dry. These were places of innovation and cooperation hubs, where trade routes may have first taken shape. But as the climate warmed and water sources evaporated, whole groups migrated away. Sandstorms buried their walls, their hearths, their tools. Today, a few scattered stones or a faint outline in the earth might hint at what once existed. But the names, languages, and beliefs of these people have vanished. In coastal regions, rising seas played an even more dramatic role. Shorelines that once bustled with life lie deep underwater, drowned by meltwater from retreating glaciers. Entire settlements slipped beneath the waves, along with rituals, stories, and memories. Divers exploring submerged landscapes sometimes stumble upon stone tools or remnants of dwellings. These discoveries feel like whispers from a world erased, a reminder that human history is far older and more complex than the surviving record suggests. Natural disasters also contributed to this silent fading. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and sudden floods struck with little warning. A thriving settlement could be buried under ash in a single day. A tsunami could sweep away entire coastlines. These events were devastating not only physically but culturally. They severed the chain of memory. Survivors scattered, carrying fragments of tradition, but often unable to preserve the full richness of their former home. Yet many disappearances were gentler, slow dissolutions, rather than catastrophic endings. A settlement might decline over generations as its people trickled into neighboring communities. Over time, their unique customs blended with those of others. Songs, tools, and rituals might survive in altered forms, but the identity of the original culture faded like smoke. In this way, civilizations did not always die. They changed, merged, and quietly disappeared into the vast tapestry of humanity. The emotional weight of these forgotten worlds is profound. Every lost settlement held laughter, conflict, celebration, grief, and hope. Children learned their first stories beside firelight. Hunters returned with pride. Families mourned their dead with rituals that no longer exist. These experiences were as vivid and meaningful as any recorded in later histories. Yet the earth, indifferent and ever-shifting, covered their traces. Archaeologists occasionally uncover hints of these vanished civilizations. A polished stone tool lying far from its likely origin, a cluster of post holes arranged in enigmatic patterns, or shards of pottery decorated with symbols no one can read. These fragments feel like messages from people who lived intensely but left no written voice behind. Each discovery asks the same unsettling question: how much have we forgotten? The truth is that the majority of humanity's story exists in this shadowy realm, unwritten, unrecorded, and largely inaccessible. What we call ancient history is only the faintest slice of what once was. Countless cultures lived and vanished before Egypt, before Mesopotamia, before the earliest empires etched their power into stone. And yet, even in their disappearance, these lost civilizations left something behind: enigmatic traces and anomalies that challenge our understanding of the past. These surviving clues, strange and unexpected, guide us toward the next chapter, the mysterious artifacts and sites that defy easy explanation. Every era leaves behind clues, but some clues refuse to fit neatly into the timelines we build. They sit like fragments from a story whose middle chapters are missing, small, stubborn reminders that early humanity may have been far more connected and capable than textbooks suggest. These anomalies do not demand impossible explanations. They simply invite us to look again, a little more closely, a little more patiently. And in the quiet of late-night reflection, they whisper a question that is difficult to ignore. What have we overlooked? One of the most striking anomalies lies in prehistoric astronomical alignments. Sites, thousands of years older than written records, reveal astonishing precision in how ancient people tracked the heavens. Stone circles oriented toward solstices, rock carvings aligned with lunar cycles, and megaliths marking specific star risings appear across continents. Many were built by societies believed to be nomadic or semi-nomadic, yet the architectural intent behind these alignments reveals deep observational knowledge. How did people without formal mathematics understand celestial rhythms with such accuracy? The question does not suggest lost technology, only lost attention. These communities watched the sky with a focus we can barely imagine. Another anomaly emerges in the form of ancient tool marks found on massive stones. In certain regions, megalithic blocks weighing dozens of tons bear evidence of shaping techniques that seem unexpectedly sophisticated for their supposed era. Straight grooves, polished surfaces, or precise cuts raise questions about the level of organization and skill required. No advanced machinery is implied, only that early builders may have had methods, cooperation, and craftsmanship far more refined than we assume. When a single stone demands hundreds of coordinated hands, it hints at societies with deep leadership structures and engineering traditions we have not fully mapped. Occasionally, artifacts appear far from where they logically belong. A piece of volcanic glass found thousands of miles from the nearest volcano. A type of seashell discovered deep within inland caves. A distinctive carving style appearing in regions without known contact. These findings are not evidence of ancient global empires, but they do point to long-distance exchanges occurring much earlier than modern models predict. It suggests that early trade networks, footpaths crossing mountains, rivers, and deserts, may have been broader and more interconnected than recorded history remembers. Symbols add another layer of mystery. Spiral motifs, geometric grids, and animal forms recur across early cultures separated by vast distances. They are not identical, yet they echo one another in suggestive ways. Did these ideas travel through migration, trade, or shared ancestral memory? Or do they reflect a universal human response to nature's patterns? The answer remains unclear, but the similarity of these symbols raises an intriguing possibility. Ancient humans may have exchanged not only goods, but also meaning. Some anomalies come not from objects, but from unexpected sophistication in construction. In a few early sites, archaeologists have discovered walls reinforced with purposeful layering, foundations designed to resist flooding, and drainage systems that hint at environmental planning long before the rise of formal engineering. These discoveries do not rewrite everything we know, but they complicate it. They reveal ancient people experimenting, adapting, and solving problems with ingenuity that shows civilization emerging in many places at once. Then there are the deeper mysteries, rare engagement spikes that make even seasoned researchers pause. A celestial carving that seems to record an eclipse far older than expected. A pattern of settlements aligned along a corridor that suggests intentional planning rather than coincidence. These findings do not demand dramatic conclusions, but they do encourage humility. Humanity's early story may be more layered, more creative, and more interconnected than we have reconstructed. What these anomalies share is not sensationalism but subtlety. They do not scream for attention. They sit quietly in museum drawers, eroding cliff faces, or overlooked excavation notes. Only when viewed together do they hint at a forgotten richness in human prehistory, a time when creativity, curiosity, and cooperation shaped the world long before writing attempted to capture it. These clues suggest that some early cultures possessed abilities or insights we have barely begun to understand. As we move to the next section, we explore what those abilities might reveal. Societies that, despite leaving little behind, demonstrated surprising mastery over their environments and their own potential. History often presents civilization as a sudden spark, an unexpected eruption of complexity along the Nile or between the rivers of Mesopotamia. But when we look more closely, we find evidence of brilliance scattered across the world thousands of years earlier than expected. These cultures appear quietly, like lanterns glowing on distant horizons. A pottery tradition in Japan that predates the pyramids by millennia. Seafaring achievements in Oceania long before the first recorded ships. Engineered structures in the Americas older than many ancient kingdoms. And architectural ingenuity in Africa that challenges every simple timeline. These societies did not wait for Egypt or Sumer to teach the world how to dream. They dreamed on their own. In Japan, the Jomon people created some of the world's earliest pottery, intricately decorated vessels emerging nearly 16,000 years ago. These were not crude containers for convenience. They were works of care and imagination, shaped with deliberate patterns that suggest both ritual purpose and aesthetic pride. Yet, the Jomon were not farmers or city builders. They were semi-sedentary foragers who developed a ceramic tradition so advanced that it forces us to rethink what primitive means. Their achievements reveal a truth we often forget. Innovation does not belong exclusively to agricultural societies. Creativity arises wherever humans observe, experiment, and dare to shape the world differently. Across the Pacific, early Oceanians were charting one of humanity's greatest feats: open ocean navigation. Long before compasses or written maps, they read stars, waves, clouds, and birds with astonishing precision. They traveled thousands of miles between islands, scattered like stepping stones across vast blue emptiness. Their voyages required complex planning, sophisticated canoe construction, and a deep understanding of celestial navigation. These were not small rafts drifting with the tide. They were engineered vessels built with collective knowledge passed from generation to generation. Their success reminds us that early humans mastered environments others considered impossible. In the Americas, long before the rise of the Maya or the Inca, there existed cultures whose achievements still puzzle researchers. At sites such as Gobekli Tepe's contemporaries in the New World Caral in Peru, Watson Brake in North America, and others, people built monumental structures without metal tools, draft animals, or even pottery in some cases. Caral, for example, features massive platform mounds and complex architectural planning, dating back nearly 5,000 years. Watson Brake pushes even further, with earthworks older than the Egyptian pyramids. These sites reveal a pattern of independent development societies, organizing labor, building ceremonial centers, and creating social systems without any connection to the cradles we often highlight. Africa, too, holds stories that seldom reach the spotlight. Along the eastern highlands and Saharan lake shores, ancient people engineered settlements and water systems long before the desert expanded. Some communities built stone structures with interlocking blocks, while others developed fishing technologies or astronomical markers that aligned with seasonal cycles. These innovations were not borrowed from elsewhere. They were rooted in local needs and shaped by local imagination. Africa, often portrayed as a recipient of outside influence, was in fact a generator of early brilliance. What unites these distant cultures is not shared contact, but shared instinct. Human beings everywhere, given time and continuity, observed their landscapes, experimented with materials, and built solutions that suited their environments. The Jomon did not need the Fertile Crescent to teach them pottery. Oceanians did not need the Mediterranean to teach them navigation. Early Americans did not need the Near East to teach them architecture. Innovation, it seems, was not a singular spark, but a constellation, many points of light emerging independently across the world. This realization forms a quiet twist. Early advanced cultures were not outliers. They were part of a global pattern. Humanity was always capable, always curious, always reaching beyond what was necessary. The problem is not that early innovation was rare. It is that so much of it was forgotten or overshadowed by later civilizations with louder voices and stronger walls. When we step back and view the ancient world as a mosaic rather than a ladder, a new picture emerges, one in which cultures across the globe mirrored one another, not through communication, but through shared human potential. Each region, shaped by its own climate and challenges, generated unique solutions: pottery in one place, navigation in another, monumental earthworks in another. These were not anomalies. They were evidence of a deeper truth. Civilization did not begin in one place. It blossomed everywhere. And this leads us naturally into the next chapter's question. If so many early cultures bloomed independently, what did they leave behind? What embers of their creativity and wisdom were carried forward into the civilizations we know today? Before Egypt carved its first hieroglyph into stone, before the first pyramid rose against the desert sky, the Nile Valley absorbed thousands of years of quiet human memory. The brilliance we admire, the ordered cosmology, the precise architecture, the intricate burial rites, did not appear suddenly. It grew from countless older traditions, shaped by hands and minds now lost to time. Egypt was not the beginning of ancient sophistication. It was a culmination, the final chapter in a story that had been unfolding for tens of thousands of years. Long before pharaohs unified their kingdoms, early peoples along the Nile practiced forms of ritual and symbolism that echoed even older cultures. They buried their dead with care, leaving grave goods, pigments, and simple ornaments beside the body. These customs mirror much earlier practices found across Africa and the ancient world, gestures that hint at a shared, ancestral belief that death was not a severing, but a transition. By the time Egypt emerged, this idea had already passed through hundreds of generations, becoming a fully developed spiritual architecture. The Egyptian fascination with the sky also reflects ancient roots. Their alignment of temples with solstices and stars built upon traditions far older than dynastic history. Long before the first pyramid was planned, early people tracked celestial cycles across Africa's deserts, savannas, and river basins. They watched the rising of Sirius, the shifting arc of Orion, and the slow turning of the heavens, observations that shaped identity as much as agriculture. In Egypt, these sky watchers evolved into astronomer priests, but the curiosity itself belonged to deep prehistory. Even the architectural genius of Egypt carries hints of inherited wisdom. Monumental construction did not begin with pyramids. Across distant landscapes, Sahara stone circles, Nubian mounds, early settlements in the Nile Valley, people experimented with shaping space, aligning stones, and building communal structures. These experiments were small compared to the pyramids, yet they represent the slow accumulation of knowledge that eventually allowed Egypt to dream on a colossal scale. The Egyptians refined these ideas, but the earliest forms, the instinct to build, to shape stone with intention, were already ancient. Symbolic art, too, shows continuity. The earliest Egyptian motifs, spirals, animals, geometric forms echo patterns seen in prehistoric Africa and beyond. These symbols carried emotional meaning long before they became formalized hieroglyphs. Early hunters painted animals moving across cave walls. Early farmers carved shapes into pottery. Early clans marked sacred sites with symbols whose meanings blended myth, memory, and identity. Egypt inherited this language of images and elevated it into an extraordinary system capable of capturing the world's complexity. The Nile acted as a great collector of ideas. People migrated along its length for thousands of years. Pastoralists from the Sahara, communities from East Africa, groups moving north or south as climates changed. They brought with them stories, rituals, artistic traditions, and practical innovations. Over time, these many streams of influence braided together, forming a cultural river as powerful as the Nile itself. When writing finally emerged, it recorded a worldview that had been forming invisibly for ages. None of this diminishes Egypt's uniqueness. Its achievements remain extraordinary. But when we imagine pyramids rising suddenly from the sand, we lose sight of the long human journey that made them possible. Egypt did not appear in a vacuum. It blossomed from the soil of older cultures, whose names we may never know, from forgotten stargazers, early architects, ritual keepers, and storytellers who shaped the psychological and spiritual foundations of the ancient world. To understand Egypt is to see it not as the dawn, but as the sunrise after a very long night, a bright moment illuminated by the faint glow of many earlier fires. Each innovation, each belief, each artistic form was an inheritance, passed through uncounted hands across millennia. And as Egypt rose, another great cultural sphere was also taking shape between two rivers. To continue this story, we now turn eastward, toward the earliest roots of Mesopotamia. Before Babylon raised its ziggurats toward the sky, before scribes pressed the first wedge-shaped marks into clay, the lands of Mesopotamia were already humming with older rhythms. Villages along the Tigris and Euphrates grew out of traditions far older than writing habits shaped by forgotten ancestors whose names have dissolved like dust in river water. What we call the cradle of civilization was not a creation from nothing. It was an inheritance, layered slowly across thousands of years by people who lived quietly, observed carefully, and passed their wisdom through memory rather than monuments. Early communities of the Fertile Crescent were already practicing forms of agriculture shaped by deep tradition. They selected seeds with care, developed irrigation systems, and learned how to coax crops from unpredictable soils. These skills did not emerge spontaneously in the Neolithic villages of Mesopotamia. They came from generations of people who watched the rise and fall of floodwaters, who learned the language of rivers long before any temple priest recorded it. When the first Mesopotamian fields appeared, they carried with them echoes of even earlier experiments, fertility rituals, planting chants, and communal techniques refined across ages. The region's famous flood myths also bear traces of older origins. The story of a great deluge appears in many Mesopotamian texts, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to Sumerian creation tales. Yet long before a scribe wrote these stories on clay tablets, humans across the ancient world faced catastrophic floods tied to melting ice, rising seas, and shifting climates. These memories, carried through oral traditions, likely merged and transformed as communities migrated into the Fertile Crescent. By the time the myths crystallized into written form, they held within them the emotional residue of experiences from long-forgotten lands, coastal homelands lost to water, riverbanks reshaped overnight, and generations remembering the trauma of environmental change. Astronomy, too, shows signs of inherited insight. The people of Mesopotamia became some of the earliest systematic skywatchers, charting planetary motions and tracking lunar cycles with remarkable precision. But the instinct to observe the heavens did not begin with them. Early pastoralists, desert wanderers, and mountain clans across the region had already spent millennia reading the night sky as a map, a calendar, and a source of meaning. The star lore of Babylon did not appear in isolation. It was built on the quiet observations of those who lay beneath open skies, long before cities claimed the land. Even communal structures in early Mesopotamian towns reveal deeper roots. The first villages were arranged around shared spaces, courtyards, storage areas, ritual hearths suggesting systems of cooperation inherited from prehistoric gatherings. These early forms of organization, passed through generations, eventually shaped the city-states that rose across the floodplains. What looks like sudden urban development was actually the gradual weaving of ancient social threads into new, denser patterns. This hidden continuity also appears in their myths and cultural symbols. The earliest Mesopotamian deities, fertility goddesses, river spirits, celestial guardians, mirror archetypes found in much older oral traditions from surrounding regions. Long before temples formalized their worship, these figures had been whispered about beside campfires, invoked in burial rites, and woven into seasonal rituals. Writing did not create these beliefs. It simply froze them in time. Beneath every carved relief and every inscribed tablet lies an unwritten world of older stories. Understanding Babylon's inheritance does not diminish its accomplishments. Instead, it deepens them. The grandeur of Mesopotamia becomes even more striking when we recognize the layers of unseen human effort beneath it. Countless small innovations, forgotten migrations, and ancestral memories that shaped its rise. The first cities did not stand on bare earth. They stood on cultural foundations built over tens of thousands of years. As we trace these echoes, another revelation emerges. The greatest inheritance passed to Babylon and to all early civilizations was not a tool or a structure or a specific myth. It was something more powerful and universal, something already ancient by the time the first clay tablet dried in the sun. This inheritance was imagination, and that brings us naturally to the next section, where we explore how imagination itself became the engine of early civilization and the legacy that still shapes our world today. Civilization did not begin with a pyramid, a ziggurat, a wall, or a king. It began with something quieter, something older than architecture, older than writing, older even than settled life. It began with a dream. Not the fleeting visions of sleep, but the deeper, enduring dream that early humans carried across continents and generations. The dream that life could be shaped, understood, and made meaningful. This dream existed long before Egypt or Babylon rose from the ground. It lived in the minds of people who left few traces behind, but whose ideas became the blueprint for everything that followed. From the earliest days, humanity learned to cooperate. Long before cities bound people together with stone, shared purpose bound them together with trust. Around ancient hearths, groups formed agreements, carried out rituals, and built the first systems of harmony. These invisible structures, woven from empathy and memory, allowed communities to survive in landscapes that were often harsh and unpredictable. Cooperation was not an invention. It was an inheritance, passed through countless acts of kindness, compromise, and shared responsibility. Storytelling added another layer to this foundation. Humans began shaping the world through words long before chisels shaped monuments. Stories taught survival skills, carried emotional wisdom, and explained the mysteries of nature. Myths became the architecture of early identity, guiding decisions and offering comfort in the face of uncertainty. Even after cities rose, these ancient tales continued to echo through temples, scrolls, and the hearts of rulers who sought meaning in the patterns of the cosmos. Civilization was built upon stories as much as upon stone. Cosmology, the attempt to understand the heavens, rooted humanity in something larger. When early people watched the slow dance of stars and recorded the turning of seasons, they were not imagining gods out of ignorance. They were searching for order in a vast and bewildering world. Their observations became calendars, rituals, and guiding principles. Later civilizations refined them, carving astrological symbols into temple walls and tracking planetary cycles with mathematics. But the first spark, the instinct to look upward with curiosity, was lit long before cities existed. Early engineering also contributed to the dream. People learned to shape water with channels, shape clay with fire, shape land with tools, and shape communities with shared planning. These small acts of ingenuity were often humble, but they marked a shift. Humans were no longer merely responding to nature, they were interacting with it, guiding it, and sometimes gently altering it. The massive constructions of Egypt and Mesopotamia were only possible because thousands of generations had experimented before them, discovering what worked and what did not. Trade networks expanded the dream outward. A shell carried inland, an obsidian blade found far from its volcanic home, a symbol carved in one region appearing in another. All were proof that early people reached beyond their own horizons. They exchanged not only materials, but ideas, rituals, and cultural threads. Long before the rise of empires, humanity was already weaving itself into a global tapestry. Art deepened this connection. A handprint on a cave wall, a carved figurine, a painted animal. These were messages to the future, declarations that life had meaning worth recording. Art allowed humans to speak across time, to send emotion and imagination forward into generations they would never meet. In many ways, art was the first promise that civilization would one day exist. All of these threads, cooperation, storytelling, cosmology, engineering, trade, and art, wove together into a dream far older than any kingdom. And when Egypt and Babylon emerged, they were not sudden miracles. They were reflections of thousands of years of human striving, experiments, and quiet brilliance. The great civilizations of the ancient world were not beginnings, they were culminations. And even now, that dream has not ended. Every culture still tells stories to understand its place in the world. Every society builds structures literal and symbolic to make life stable and meaningful. Every generation looks at the stars and wonders what lies beyond. The same imagination that animated early humans continues to shape us today. Civilization was not born in stone. It was born in the human mind, in our ability to imagine what does not yet exist, to create meaning from chaos, and to pass those ideas forward. That is the legacy of our forgotten ancestors, the dream that built every city, every ritual, every story, every hope. And as we close this journey, the path does not end. Beyond Egypt and Babylon lie countless other forgotten eras, waiting in the dark worlds erased, yet still whispering through the few traces they left behind. The invitation is simple. Look deeper, and the past will reveal its hidden fires.